Hey there, and welcome back. If the day has worn you down and you are ready now to set it aside, then you are in the right place, and you can let the whole of it go, softly, into the dark. Tonight, I would like to carry you back more than 500 years into the candlelit world of medieval England, to keep company with a young woman whose name most people have never heard, though she was born to one of the greatest fortunes in the land and stood, more than once, within arm's reach of a throne. Her name was Isabel. She was the elder of two sisters, daughters of the most powerful nobleman in England, and she was clever and grave and dutiful, and almost everything that happened to her in her short life was decided by other people, by her father, by her husband, by the wars of the age. She had a sister she loved more than anyone alive, and a mother she could not save, and a marriage she did not choose, and she died before she was 26, and the age very nearly forgot her. We are going to spend this night with her, you and I, not as a footnote to greater names, but as herself. A real young woman who lived and loved and grieved inside one of the most dangerous families of her age. For this is a story of two sisters raised with only each other, who would be married by their father's design into the two opposing sides of a civil war, and torn between them for the rest of their lives. And the one we have come for tonight is the elder, the quiet one, the one history left in shadow, whose whole heart, before the end, would be given to a sister she could not always reach, and a mother the law itself would one day pretend was dead. Before we step back into her time, let me say one quiet thing, and then I will leave it be. If these slow journeys into the far past are a comfort to you at the close of the day, a place to lay down the weight of the present and rest a while, then you would be most welcome to stay, to subscribe, so that the next of these long nights can find its own way to you, whenever it is ready and wherever you happen to be. There is never any hurry in it. And I do love to know who is travelling with me on these nights, and from how far away. So if you ever feel moved to leave a few words about the part of the world you are listening from, and the hour it happens to be there, I look through those messages often, and there is a deep and simple pleasure in seeing the scattered places where these old stories are heard in the dark. But none of that matters now. For now there is nothing you need do, and nowhere you need be, and all that matters at all is your rest. Picture this. It is a grey afternoon in the autumn of the year 1451, and within the thick walls of a great castle in the heart of England, in a warm and curtained chamber high above the river, a child is being born. She is a daughter, the first living child of a young and rising lord and his lady, and she comes into a place of wealth and expectation, for her family is among the mightiest in the land. They name her Isabel, and though no one in that chamber can know it, this small girl, swaddled now and held to the fire, will grow up to stand at the very centre of the storms of her age, married to a king's brother. Sister to a queen, the bearer of one of the richest inheritances in England, and she will be dead before she is 26, and most of those who come after will scarcely remember she lived at all. The castle she was born in was Warwick, the seat of the Earls of Warwick, a mighty fortress of pale stone rising sheer above the river Avon, with its broad round towers and its high curtain walls and its broad halls hung with tapestry, one of the grandest houses in the kingdom. And the man whose daughter she was, her father, was the most powerful nobleman in all of England, a man who would come to be called, by those who watched him make and unmake kings, the Kingmaker. So Isabel was born to greatness, to the very summit of the realm below the crown itself, and from her earliest breath she was a person of consequence, a piece in the endless game of marriages and inheritances by which the noble houses of England rose and fell. And the moment of her birth fell in a brief lull between storms, in a year when the long quarrel that we call the Wars of the Cousins had paused but not ended. The great families of the kingdom watching one another warily across an uneasy peace. She came into the world in the early autumn of that year, in the great chamber of the castle, attended as the firstborn of so mighty a house would be attended, with all the care and ceremony that wealth and rank could provide. Her coming was a matter of consequence from her very first breath, for she was the heir, so far, to the whole of her father's and her mother's vast estates, the channel through which, if no brother came, all that greatness would one day pass. A herald might have noted her birth, the household certainly rejoiced in it, and her father, that ambitious and far-seeing man, will already have begun, even over the cradle of his infant daughter, to turn over in his mind the uses to which, in the fullness of time, so valuable a child might be put. She was loved, I do not doubt, as a baby is loved. But she was also, from the first, an asset, a piece of the family's future, and the two things, the love and the calculation, would run side by side through the whole of her life. But I do not want you to see her tonight only as a piece on a board, for she was a living girl before she was a pawn, and it is the living girl I want to give back to you. Let me tell you what we can know of her, and what we can gently imagine. She was, by the few hints that survive, a grave and careful child, thoughtful, dutiful, with something serious in her, even when she was small. She was the elder of two, and the elder child in such a house carries a weight the younger does not, for she is the first, the one watched most closely, the one in whom the hopes are first invested. And Isabel seems to have grown up with the quiet, responsible cast of one who knew, almost before she could have put words to it, that much was expected of her. She was not, in the end, to be an only child for long, for when she was not quite 5 years old, a sister was born, a second daughter, and they named the new baby Anne. And that birth, the coming of that sister, was the most important thing that ever happened to Isabel, more important than any marriage or any crown. For the two of them, the grave elder and the younger who came after, would be bound together for the whole of their lives by a love deeper than anything else either of them would know. We will come to Anne and to that bond, for it is the heart of our story. But hold, for now the picture of the older girl, 4 years old and a little more, looking down at the new sister in her cradle, not yet understanding that this small creature would be, through every storm that was coming, the one person in all the world who was truly hers. For the world Isabel was born into was a beautiful and a terrible one, and the beauty and the terror were braided together in a way she would feel all her life. The beauty was the beauty of her rank, the soft wools and fine linens, the warm fires, the music and the feasts, the fine houses and the wide lands, the deference of servants, the security of wealth. She wanted for nothing that money could buy. She was dressed like a little lady, fed the best the age could offer, raised in chambers, kept warm against the cold, surrounded from her first days by people whose business was her comfort and her care. It was as soft and as cushioned a childhood as that hard century could provide, and in its outward things, it was a fortunate one. But under the softness ran the terror, the knowledge, never far off in such a family, of how suddenly and how completely the mighty could fall. For her father's greatness was not a quiet, settled greatness, but a fierce and grasping one, built on power and ambition and the willingness to fight. And in those years England was sliding into the long civil wars we have come to call the Wars of the Roses, in which the great families tore at one another for the crown. And a man who stood as high as her father stood had as far to fall as any man alive. She grew up, that is, in a house at the very top of an order that was beginning to shake, and some part of her, the grave and careful part, must have sensed from early on that nothing was as safe as it looked, that the warmth and the wealth and the deference could all be swept away in an afternoon, as they had been swept away for other proud houses she would have heard whispered of. And so this is the girl we have come to know, Isabel, the elder daughter, born to the summit of England in a shaking age, grave and dutiful and watchful, with a little Anne newly come into the world who would be the love and the anchor of her whole life. She had, at the moment we have found her, every advantage the age could give, and no power at all over her own fate, for she was a daughter, and a daughter of a great house was the most valuable and the least free of creatures, a treasure to be spent, in time, on whatever alliance would raise her family higher. What that spending would cost her, she could not yet dream. But to understand it, we must first understand exactly what she was worth, the vast and glittering inheritance that made her, from birth, one of the great prizes of the kingdom. Come with me a little deeper into her time, and let me show you what she was born to. Before we speak of inheritances and crowns, let us stay a while with the one thing in Isabel's life that was wholly her own, the one tie that no father arranged and no war could quite destroy, her devotion to her sister. For of all the people who would move through Isabel's short life, her father, her husband, the kings and the lords who decided her fate, only one was truly hers, chosen by her heart and not by anyone's design, and that was Anne, the younger sister who came into the world when Isabel was nearly 5. Think of what it was to be those two girls in that great house in that age. They were the daughters of a man who was almost a king, and the daughters of such a man lived a strange and elevated existence, held apart, raised with ceremony, surrounded by attendants, but also, in a deep way, alone. Their parents were mighty people, busy with the affairs of the realm, often away, often distant, even when near. For that was the way of noble families, where children were loved, but not lived among in the close, daily fashion of humbler homes. The girls were given a household of their own, a small establishment with its own servants and a governess to rule it, and they were raised largely apart from their mother and father, in their own chambers, their own routines, their own small sphere within the larger household of the castle. And in that somewhat solitary grandeur, the two sisters had, most truly and most lastingly, each other. Isabel was the elder, and I think we may picture her in that role from very early, the one who went first, who knew the way, who looked after the younger. There is something in the position of a firstborn sister, especially in such a household, that shapes a girl toward care and responsibility. For she is the one the younger follows, the one who must be patient, who must share, who must sometimes give way. And Anne, 4.5 years behind, would have been the one who looked up, who trailed after, who learned from her elder sister how to be in that grand and watchful world. So the tie between them had a particular shape, the protective older girl and the trusting younger, a shape it would keep, I believe, to the very end, through everything that the years would do to them both. We do not have their words, of course. No one wrote down the games they played, or the secrets they shared, or the quarrels they made up after, for the doings of two young girls, even high-born ones, were beneath the notice of the chroniclers, who cared only for battles and successions. But we do not need the records to know what such a bond would have been, for it is one of the oldest and truest things in the world, the two of them close in age and closer in circumstance, with no one else who quite understood their peculiar life, growing up together as the first companion each of them had, the first rival, the first friend. They shared a nursery and then a schoolroom. They learned the same lessons, the needlework and the music and the letters and the prayers that a great lady must know. They were dressed alike, very likely, in the rich garments of their rank. They slept and woke close together, passed the long-ordered days of a noble childhood in one another's constant company, and out of all that nearness grew the one bond in her life that was freely given and freely returned. We can even glimpse, a little, the shape of their shared upbringing, for the children of so great a house were raised with a care and an order that left some faint trace in the records. The two girls had a governess set over them, a lady of rank charged with their teaching and their conduct, and a handful of women to wait on them, so that their nursery was a court of its own. with its rules and its hours and its careful watchfulness. They would have been taught together, the firstborn a step ahead of the younger, the same lessons coming to Anne in her turn that the elder had learned before her, so that each stage of their growing was a thing they passed through one after the other, the elder lighting the way. They learned their letters and their French and the reading of devout and improving books. They learned music and dancing and the fine needlework that was the mark of a great lady. They learned above all the manners and the bearing of their rank, how to move and speak and carry themselves as the daughters of the greatest house in England. And through all of it, in lesson and in leisure, they had each other, the two of them, at the centre of that small revolving world of women, bound closer by every shared hour. It matters, this bond, more than anything else I will tell you tonight, because of what was coming. For the deep cruelty of Isabel's story, and of Anne's, is that the two girls who had only one another would be taken by their father and spent like coins on opposite sides of a war, married into rival houses that were trying to destroy one another, set against each other by the very men who were supposed to protect them. They would be parted. They would be made, on parchment at least, enemies. They would be caught up, the two of them, in a struggle over lands and crowns that cared nothing for the love between them. And through all of it, I want you to hold on to this, the picture of the two girls in their shared nursery at Warwick, before any of it began, when the only thing that mattered to either of them was the other. And the wars were only a distant rumour, and they had, still, the simple and complete possession of each other's company. There is a particular tenderness in a firstborn sister's heart, and I think Isabelle had it in full. The firstborn carries a kind of responsibility for the younger that is never quite spoken and never quite put down. She remembers the little one as a baby in the cradle. She has known her from the very beginning. She feels, in some wordless way, that the little one is hers to look after. And when the storms came, and the pair of them were swept apart and set against each other by forces neither could control, I believe it was this, the elder sister's helpless, faithful care, that survived in Isabelle beneath everything. The wish to protect a sister she could no longer protect. To reach a sister, the men in their lives kept pulling out of reach. We will see that devotion tested almost beyond bearing. We will see it strained by rivalry and distance and the scheming of husbands. But we will not, I think, see it broken, for some bonds are stronger than the worst that the age can do to them. And the bond between these two was one of those. So that is where we begin with the truest thing in Isabel's life, the love between two daughters of a dangerous house, raised together and apart in their grand and lonely childhood. Everything else that happened to her, every marriage and every grief, must be measured against this, the one relationship she did not choose and could not lose. But the world would not leave the two girls in their nursery for long, for they were not ordinary girls, and their father had plans for them that reached to the very steps of the throne. To understand what was coming, we must understand what made these two girls so dangerously valuable, and that is a matter of land and blood and one of the greatest fortunes in all of England. Come with me, and let me show you the inheritance that hung over both their lives. Now let me bring you the other deep attachment of Isabel's early life, gentler and more complicated than the bond with her sister, and that is the love between Isabelle and her mother. For the lady who bore her was no ordinary one, and the bond between them, though softened by the formality of the age, was a true and tender one, and it would become, before the end, the source of one of the deepest sorrows of Isabel's life. Her mother was a rich heiress in her own right, a countess in her own blood, the daughter and the heir of one of the oldest and richest noble lines in England. It was through her mother, not her father, that the vast inheritance flowed which made Isabelle and her sister so dangerously valuable, for her father, mighty as he was, had risen so high in part by marrying this quiet, wealthy, well-born lady whose lands and title were among the grandest in the realm. For the blood that came down through Isabel's mother was very old and very great. The blood of two mighty lines joined in her, the Beauchamp Earls of Warwick, and through her own mother, the Despensers. Names that rang through the history of medieval England and carried with them vast estates, spread across many counties. The Countess was the sole heiress of all of it, the last of her line. And when she married Isabel's father, she brought him not merely a wife, but a kingdom in little, the lands and castles and revenues that lifted him, almost overnight, into the very first rank of the nobility. It was a sobering thing, when you think on it, that the whole towering greatness of the Kingmaker, all his power to make and break kings, rested in large part on the inheritance of this one quiet woman, his wife. And it was that same inheritance, her mother's birthright, that would make Isabel and Anne such glittering prizes, and would draw down upon the whole family, in the end, so much grief. The greatness came through the mother. So, in time, did the sorrow. So Isabel's mother was a person of real consequence, not merely a mighty lord's wife, but a great fortune in herself. And Isabel grew up knowing, in the wordless way that children know such things, that her mother was someone, that the very ground they stood on came down through her. But to a small girl, of course, a mother is not an heiress or a countess. She is simply the warm centre of the world, the face one turns to, the lap one climbs into, the voice that soothes in the dark. And here we must be careful, for the mothering of the age was not the close, constant, hands-on mothering we know now. A noble lady did not raise her children herself in the daily way. That was the work of nurses and governesses and a whole household of women. The children had their own establishment, their own rooms, their own attendants, and saw their parents less than we might think. On appointed occasions, with a degree of ceremony, the small ones brought to their mother rather than living always at her side. So the love between daughter and mother was real but measured, warm but framed by the customs of a world that kept even mothers and daughters at a certain stately distance. And yet within that frame there was, I am sure, genuine tenderness, for the records that survive suggest a close and loyal family. And Isabel's mother seems to have been a steady, careful, devoted woman, the sort who held her household together and watched over her daughter's upbringing with real attention. Picture the child brought to her mother in the high chamber, in her best little gown, to be looked at and spoken with, and perhaps embraced. The mother grave and kind, asking after her lessons, her health, her prayers. Picture the small girl watching her mother move through the rooms of the castle in her rich clothes, mistress of all that bustle, and feeling the particular pride a girl feels in a mother who is admired and obeyed. Picture the two of them, mother and child, in quieter moments, at their needlework or their devotions together, the elder teaching, the younger the things a noble lady must know. For that was much of what a mother gave a daughter in that age. Not the constant nursery care, but the long, patient training in how to be a woman of rank. The girl learned from her mother, and from the women her mother set over her, the whole art of being a lady, how to carry herself, how to govern a household, how to sew and to pray and to order servants and to receive guests, how to be gracious and dignified and devout, how to be, in short, the kind of lady she herself was, a countess in the making. So the bond between them was woven through with this, the passing down of a way of life from mother to daughter, the mother shaping the younger in her own image, preparing her for the grand marriage and the great household that everyone knew lay somewhere in her future. And there is a particular poignancy in this relationship, knowing what we know of how it would end. For Isabel's mother would outlive her. The daughter would die young, at 25, worn out by childbearing and illness, and the mother would go on living for years afterward, an old woman who had buried both her girls. And worse than that, far worse, in the years between, the girl would be forced to watch her mother suffer a cruelty almost beyond belief, stripped of her lands, shut away, and at last declared by the law itself to be as good as dead, though she lived and breathed, so that the inheritance might be carved up among others, and she and her husband would be among those who profited from that cruelty. We will come to that dreadful business in its place. But I want you to hold now the tenderness that came before it, the small girl and her grave, kind mother, the lessons and the needlework and the quiet pride, before the years turned that love into a source of helpless grief. Because that, in the end, is the shape of so much of Isabel's life, that the things she loved most, her sister, her mother, would be turned against her or torn from her by the vast cold forces of her age, by war and ambition and the hunger for land. She was a girl with a deep capacity for love, raised among people she truly cared for, and she would spend her short life watching those loves complicated, divided, and grieved, helpless to protect the people who mattered to her most. That helplessness is, I think, the truest note of her story. The kind, dutiful daughter who could save no one, not her sister, not her mother, not in the end herself. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is brightness still before the sorrow, for her childhood was not all formality and foreboding. Much of it was passed in a place I should like to show you now, a strange and vivid corner of her father's world, quite unlike the green English country where she was born. Come with me across the water. To Calais. Isabelle was not quite 6 when her father was made captain of Calais, and the family crossed to live there, and so a great deal of her girlhood was passed inside those walls. It was, of all the places England held, the most singular, a town that was not in England at all, the one foothold the crown still kept upon the far shore. And so the little girl was taken from the green heart of England to a salt-aired garrison on a foreign coast, and there she passed some of the most vivid years of her childhood. Imagine what it was, to a child, that crossing and that place. First, the sea itself, the journey by ship over the grey straits, the heaving deck and the smell of salt and tar, the gulls, the wind, the strange sickening tilt of the water, and then, rising out of the haze, the walls of Calais, ringed with their towers, the harbour crowded with shipping, the banners, the soldiers. For Calais was above all a military town, a garrison, England's chief fortress on the continent, packed with men-at-arms and archers, and all the apparatus of war, for it sat in hostile country, the one English foothold in a France that wanted it back. And it had to be held by strength. And it was more than a fortress, for Calais was also the beating heart of England's most precious trade. It was here, through this one town, that the vast export of English wool was funnelled, the wool on which so much of the kingdom's wealth was built, gathered and weighed and sold through the company of merchants who held the staple there. So Calais was rich as well as strong, a busy commercial port, heavy with the traffic of the wool trade, its quays piled high with the wool sacks, its harbour thick with the ships that carried England's wealth to the markets of the Low Countries. To command Calais, as her father did, was therefore to hold not only a mighty fortress, but a rich source of money and influence, a power base, half military and half mercantile, and it gave him resources and a standing that few other lords could match. The little girl grew up, then, in a place that was at once a war engine and a counting house, a frontier garrison and a merchant's port, and the strange double character of it, all soldiers and wool sacks, banners and ledgers, was part of the vivid texture of her earliest years. To a small girl from a quiet inland castle, it must have been a scene of endless strange wonder, the soldiers everywhere, the foreign tongues in the streets and the harbour, the constant coming and going of ships from England and from the ports of the Low Countries, the sense of standing at the very edge of the English world, with the unknown beyond. And we may let ourselves imagine, a little, what such a place sounded like to a child growing up inside it, for a garrison keeps its own music. There would have been the tramp of drilling men in the yards below, the call of trumpets marking the watches of the day, the clatter of harness and the ring of the armourer at his work. There would have been the cry of gulls over the harbour, and the slap of water against the quays, and the foreign speech of the country beyond the walls drifting in on market days. And under it all, the constant nearness of the sea, the salt in the air, the grey horizon of water that hemmed the town about and was the road to everywhere, to England in one direction and to the great markets of the continent in the other. A child raised in such a place would carry its sounds and its sea light in her for the rest of her days, and I think we are right to suppose that the sea, which would later take so much from her, was simply the familiar element of Isabel's earliest world, as ordinary to her as the Midland fields were to children at home. And her father was its lord. That is a thing worth pausing on, for it shaped how Isabel saw him and how she saw herself. In England, her father was a mighty earl among other mighty earls, mighty but not supreme. In Calais he was master the captain, the man whose word ran, the commander of the garrison and the governor of the town. The little girl lived in Calais as the daughter of the man who ruled the place, in the captain's lodgings within the fortress, surrounded by the deference due to the family of the commander. So Calais taught Isabel, very early, what it was to be at the top, to be the daughter of the man in charge, and it must have fixed in her young mind an image of her father as a figure of enormous power, the lord of a fortress, the keeper of England's gate. It was in Calais, too, that the family was most together, most itself in those years. The two little girls growing up within the walls of the great garrison, their mother keeping the household, their father coming and going on the business of the realm. For even then he was deep in the affairs and intrigues of England, crossing back and forth, drawn ever further into the quarrels that would become open war. Calais was a kind of base for him, a stronghold he could trust, a place from which he sailed to meddle in the kingdom's politics, and to which he could retreat when things went against him. And so the girls' childhood in Calais was lived against a background of their father's ceaseless, dangerous activity, the comings and goings, the messengers, the gathering of men and ships, the sense, even to a child, that weighty matters were always in motion just beyond the edge of the nursery. There is something fitting, looking back, in Isabel spending those formative years in such a place. For Calais was a threshold, a between place, neither wholly England nor wholly abroad, a fortress poised on the edge of things. And Isabel's whole life would be lived in such in-between places, caught between sides, between her father and her husband, between her sister and herself, between one cause and another, never quite able to choose her own ground. She learned, perhaps, in that garrison town, the feeling of belonging somewhere, always under threat, always contested, always one reverse away from being lost. And Calais itself would loom again in her story, for it was to Calais that she would be brought years later, as a grown woman, to be married in defiance of a king. And it was off the coast of Calais, in the end, that one of the most terrible nights of her life would unfold, aboard a ship that could not come to harbour. But that is far ahead. For now, hold the child Isabel in the garrison by the sea, in the captain's lodgings within the great walls, the soldiers and the ships and the salt wind, the foreign town that her father ruled. The family more together there than they would ever quite be again. It was, in its strange way, a kind of golden time. The years in Calais, the whole family gathered in one strong fortress, the wars not yet broken into open ruin, the two little girls safe within the walls of their father's fortress. Such times do not last, and this one did not. For the quarrels of England were rising toward catastrophe, and her father stood at the very centre of them. And the rising storm would soon sweep the family up and scatter it, and change everything for the two girls forever. But before the storm, there were these years by the sea, and I wanted you to have them, the bright, strange edge of the world childhood of a girl who would have so few untroubled years. Soon enough the wars would come, and she would begin to learn the hardest lesson of her rank, that a daughter of a great house is not a person with a life of her own, but a treasure to be spent. To understand how that lesson came to her, we must turn now to the thing that hung over her whole girlhood, the question of whom she would marry, and the dazzling, dangerous purpose her father had in mind for her. Come with me, and let us see how she was promised. There comes a point in the life of every daughter of a great house when she learns what she is for, and for Isabel that point came, as she grew toward womanhood, when it became clear that her father meant to use her, his elder daughter and his greatest heiress, for the highest purpose of all. For her father did not think small. He had made and unmade kings. He stood second to no man in England, but the sovereign himself, and he intended his daughters to marry not merely well, but royally, to carry his blood and his ambition to the very steps of the throne. And the husband he settled upon for her was a prince of the blood royal, a king's own brother. The young man chosen for her was George, Duke of Clarence, the younger brother of the reigning sovereign, Edward IV. Clarence was young and handsome and charming and dangerously close to the throne, for he stood next in line after Edward. And in those years, before the king had sons of his own, Clarence stood very near to being heir to the crown itself. To marry Isabel to Clarence was therefore a breathtaking stroke, for it would make her the wife of a man who might, if fortune turned, come to the throne, and Isabel herself, in that case, a queen. It was the grandest match in the kingdom, and her father reached for it for his elder daughter as the natural prize of his greatness. He was, this George, a glittering match on the face of it, for he stood very near indeed to the throne, until the king should father sons of his own. Clarence was his heir, the next man in line for the crown of England, so that to marry him was to marry the second man in the kingdom, perhaps the future sovereign himself. For the daughter of the Kingmaker, ambitious as her father was, no greater earthly prize could well have been imagined. The match set her within touching distance of the throne. What manner of man he was beneath the dazzle, what lay behind the prince's smile, she would learn only later, in the living of the marriage, and I will keep that for its place. On the day she was shown her bridegroom, there was only the glamour of him, and the giddy height of the match. But here is the thing that turns this from a triumph into the beginning of a tragedy, for the marriage was forbidden. Edward Clarence's brother did not want it. He had grown wary of Isabel's father, this over-mighty subject, who had helped raise him to the throne and now seemed to seek to rule him. And he saw, clearly enough, what it would mean to let the Kingmaker marry his daughter to the heir presumptive, to bind his own kin to the most powerful and ambitious man in the realm. So the crown refused its leave. He set his face against the match and forbade the match. And her father, who was not a man to be told no, resolved to have the marriage anyway, in defiance of the crown. And that defiance would be the first open step toward rebellion and ruin. Now I want you to think, for a moment, about her in all this. For she is so easily lost in it, the girl at the centre of the great men's quarrel. What did she feel? This girl of 17, perhaps 17 years old. To be told that she was to marry a king's brother against the sovereign's own will. We cannot know her heart directly, for no one asked her or recorded her, but we can imagine our way toward it, and we should, for she was a living girl and not a clause in a treaty. There must have been a kind of dazzlement in it. Surely the prospect of marrying a royal duke, of becoming a duchess, of standing within reach of a crown, for she had been raised to want exactly such a match. Raised from the cradle to long for exactly such a summit. To a girl so raised, the news that she was to wed a royal duke would have come as the fulfillment of everything she had been prepared for. But there must have been fear in it too, and I think the grave and careful girl would have felt the fear as keenly as the dazzlement. For she was old enough by now to understand that her father was defying his sovereign, and that such defiance was perilous, that it could lead to disaster, to the fall of the family, to war. She would have understood that her marriage was not merely a wedding but a weapon, a move in her father's dangerous game, and that she herself was being placed at the very point of the quarrel between the two mightiest men in the realm. To be the prize over which a crown and a kingmaker contended was a perilous place for a young woman to stand, and she, watchful and intelligent, can hardly have failed to feel the danger of it, even as she was swept toward the splendour. And there was the man himself to wonder about, this Clarence she was being given to, whom she may scarcely have known. He was a charming and a glamorous figure, a royal prince, but he was also, as the world would learn, unstable, ambitious, treacherous, a man who would betray his own brother more than once and come, in the end, to a traitor's death. Did she sense any of that, meeting her betrothed, or did she see only the handsome young duke, the dazzling match? We cannot know. But she was tying her life to a man of dangerous temper. And whether she felt any foreboding of it, or went to him with a girl's hopeful heart, the marriage would carry her into the very heart of every storm that was coming. For Clarence was a man who could not keep still, and a wife of such a man would never know peace. What is certain is that she had no choice in any of it. That is the hard truth at the centre of her whole life, and it is worth saying plainly. She was not asked. Her wishes were not consulted. She was a daughter, and a daughter's marriage was her father's to bestow, and her father had chosen, for reasons of power and ambition that had nothing to do with her happiness, to wed her to a royal duke against the will of a king. Whatever she felt, dazzlement or dread or both, she would do as she was told, for there was no other path open to a girl of her age and her rank. And so, obedient, dutiful, perhaps half thrilled and half afraid, she was made ready to be married, and carried across the sea to Calais, to the very fortress of her childhood, to become, in defiance of the crown, the wife of a royal duke. Come with me to that wedding, and let me show you the day the elder daughter became a duchess. In the high summer of the year 1469, when Isabel was 17 years old, she was married, and the manner of it tells you everything about the strange and dangerous position she had been born into. For her wedding was not a joyous public celebration in a great English minster, with the crown's blessing and the realm looking on. It was a thing done over the sea, in defiance of the crown, in the fortress town of her childhood, a wedding that was also, in its way, a declaration of war. They took her to Calais to be married, back over the narrow sea to the great garrison where she had spent her early years. There was a reason for this. In England, the king had forbidden the match, and to marry there in open defiance would have been to court immediate disaster. But Calais was her father's own stronghold, his fortress, the one place where his word ran absolute and the royal writ could be kept at arm's length. And so it was there, behind those strong walls and beyond that protecting water, that her father chose to defy his sovereign and marry his daughter to the king's brother. The very choice of place was a measure of how perilous the thing was, that it had to be done in a fortress beyond the sea where no one could prevent it, and so Isabel was wed. The ceremony was held in the church of Calais, and it was conducted fittingly by a member of her own family, her uncle, her father's brother, who was a great churchman, an archbishop, lending the weight of the church to this act of defiance. Picture the scene, for it was splendid in its way, despite the shadow over it. The chapel hung with rich cloths, the bride in her finest, the young Duke of Clarence at her side, handsome and royal. The great men of her father's affinity gathered to witness it, the archbishop in his vestments, the solemn words spoken, the vows exchanged. By all the outward show, it was a magnificent match. The elder daughter of the mightiest noble in England, wedded to a prince of the blood, a duke, the brother of the sovereign. In that chapel in Calais, Isabel became a duchess and stood, in that moment, nearer to the throne of England than almost any woman in the land. There was even a difficulty of the church to be got around, for Isabel and her bridegroom were cousins, related within the degrees that canon law forbade, and a marriage between such kin required a special dispensation from the Pope to be lawful. Her father had sought that dispensation, and there had been delay over it, the papal grant slow in coming, and some have wondered whether the wedding went ahead before the document was safely in hand. So eager was her father to bind Clarence to him before the king could prevent it. Whether the dispensation came in good time, or whether the match was hurried through ahead of it, the haste of the thing tells us how urgent her father judged it, how much hung in his mind on getting his daughter wed to the king's brother without delay. And no sooner was the wedding done than the masks came off entirely, for her father and her new husband published, then and there, a manifesto against the king's government, a list of grievances and demands dressed up as the complaints of loyal subjects, and called the discontented of England to rise. The wedding and the rebellion were one act. The marriage and the manifesto issued almost in the same breath, and she, the new-made duchess, was its living seal. But it was a wedding with a sword hanging over it, and everyone in that chapel knew it. For this marriage was an act of rebellion, by marrying his daughter to Clarence against the crown's express command. Isabel's father had thrown down a challenge to the crown itself, had declared in effect that he would do as he pleased, sovereign or no. And worse, the marriage was the first move in a far larger design, for her father and her new husband were even then plotting to rise against the king, to seize power, perhaps to set Clarence himself upon the throne in his brother's place. The wedding was not the end of a courtship, but the opening of a campaign, and the duchess, in becoming Clarence's wife, was being made the living link in an alliance meant to shake the kingdom to its roots. So consider what it was for her, the bride at the centre of it. She had her day of splendour, her fine clothes and her royal husband and her new rank, the fulfilment of everything she had been raised toward. And yet the splendour was laced through with menace, for she cannot have failed to understand that her wedding was a blow struck against the crown, that she was being married into the heart of a conspiracy, that the men she loved and obeyed, her father and now her husband, were embarked on a course that could lead to glory or to utter ruin. A girl of 17, on what should have been the happiest day of her life, stood in that chapel as a piece in a deadly game, her marriage a weapon, her wedding day the first day of a war. And there is something else to feel in that Calais wedding, the absence at it. For where was her sister Anne? The younger was still a child, not yet 13, still unmarried, still at home. The two sisters who had been each other's whole world were now being separated by Isabel's grand new estate. The elder swept up into marriage and rebellion and the dangerous orbit of a royal husband, the younger left behind in the nursery, a girl still. From this day, their paths began to diverge. The duchess and the child, and though neither could have known it, they were being set by their father's schemes on courses that would carry them into opposite camps of the coming war. The wedding that raised the young woman so high was also the beginning of the long separation of the sisters. The first turning of the two girls away from the shared world of their childhood and into the divided and dangerous world of grown women used as counters by powerful men. I want you to hold both things together. Then, as we leave the chapel at Calais, the splendour and the shadow. The radiance was real, so was the danger woven into it. Her happiness mortgaged to her father's reckless reach for power. She went from that church the wife of a king's brother and the daughter of a man in open revolt against the crown. And the days that followed would not be days of wedded peace, but days of conspiracy and rising and flight. For her father and her husband moved at once from the wedding to the war, and she, the new-made duchess, was swept up in the storm they raised, carried along in their wake, whether she would or no. Come with me into the first months of her marriage, and let me show you the man she had wed, and the tempest he carried her into. So Isabel was a wife now, a duchess, mistress of her own large estate, and we should pause to consider what kind of life that was, and above all, what kind of man she had been given to. For the husband, a woman married in that age would shape the rest of her days, and Isabel's husband was a man who would shape hers in ways no one could have wished. And being a duchess was no mere title, but a great worldly estate. As the wife of the king's brother, Isabel was now one of the foremost women in England, entitled to her own jointure of lands, her own income, her own train of servants and attendants, her own place near the very top of the kingdom's order of precedence. Had she gone freely to court, she would have ranked above almost every other woman in the land. In the country, she was a great landholder in right of her marriage, mistress of estates whose rents made her rich. It was the position her father had schemed for years to win for her, the dazzling summit of a great match, and on paper, it was everything. The cruelty of her story is that the title came wrapped in rebellion, and that the rank, so dearly bought, would bring her far less peace than it seemed to promise. But the rank itself was real, and for a little while. Before the storm broke, Isabel was as grand a lady as any in the kingdom. Let me tell you about George of Clarence, the man she had wed. He was a son of the House of York, brother to the king. And he had all the gifts of his line, tall and well-made and handsome, eloquent, charming when he chose to be, with the easy grace of a prince raised to expect the world's deference. To a young bride he must have seemed a dazzling figure, a royal duke, glamorous and golden, the very image of what a fine husband should be. But beneath the charm there was something badly wrong in George of Clarence. Something restless and grasping and untrustworthy, a vanity that could never be satisfied, and an ambition that no honour could fill. He was a man who always wanted more, who could never be content with his lot, however high it was raised, who would betray anyone, even his own brother, even his own father by marriage, if he thought it might bring him nearer to the crown he believed he deserved. This was the man to whom Isabel was bound for life, and she cannot, at first, have known the worst of him. A young wife sees the husband he chooses to show her, and Clarence, courting the favour of his powerful father by marriage, would have been at his most charming in those early days. Perhaps Isabel was happy at the start. Perhaps she felt herself fortunate, the wife of so brilliant a prince, and went into her marriage with a hopeful heart. We cannot know. But she was tied to a man whose nature would carry them both through betrayal after betrayal, from rebellion to reconciliation, and back to rebellion again. A man who could not be still, could not be loyal, could not be satisfied, and whose endless turning would keep Isabel's married life in a state of danger and upheaval. And consider the strange position she occupied, caught from the very first between the two men who ruled her life, her father and her husband. For a time those two were allies, joined in their plot against the king, and so her loyalties were not yet torn. But she was the link between them, the wife of the one and the daughter of the other, and her whole importance, her one function in the great game, was to bind these two ambitious men together through her body and her blood. She was not a person in the alliance, but the hinge of it, the living joint that held her father and her husband in their dangerous partnership. And when that partnership broke, as it would, she would be caught in the breaking. Torn between the father she owed obedience and the husband she owed obedience, with no way to be loyal to both, what was her daily life in those first married months? She was a duchess, and that meant a large household of her own, or rather her husband's, which she would be expected to order and oversee, the management of servants and stores and hospitality, the running of a noble establishment, the duties of a great-born lady. She would have had her own ladies and servants, her rich clothes and her fine chambers, all the trappings of her exalted rank. She would have been expected, above all, to do the one thing a wife of her station existed to do, to bear children, sons especially, to continue her husband's line, and to knit the great inheritance she carried into the next generation. From the very beginning, that expectation would have hung over her, the duty to breed, the watching for signs that the young duchess was with child. But the ordinary business of a duchess's life, the household and the hospitality and the waiting for an heir, was from the first overshadowed in Isabel's case by the extraordinary business her husband and her father were about. For she had married not into peace, but into the very engine of rebellion. Even as she settled into her new estate, the two men were moving toward open revolt, gathering their friends, stirring up discontent, preparing to challenge the king by force. Her marriage had been the signal and the seal of their alliance, and now that alliance was about to burst into the open, into risings and battles and all the chaos of civil war. The Duchess of a few weeks would have no quiet time to learn her new role, for the storm her marriage had helped to raise was breaking even as she entered her husband's house. So this is Isabelle at the threshold of her married life, a young woman of 17 or 18, wed to a charming and dangerous prince, mistress of a great household, the living link in a treasonous alliance. Expected to bear heirs and to keep a noble establishment while the men who owned her fate plunged the kingdom toward war. She had power and wealth and rank beyond the dreams of almost any woman alive, and not one shred of control over the forces that were about to sweep her up. And sweep her up they did, almost at once. For within a short while of her wedding, the rebellion broke into the open, and Isabelle, the new duchess, found herself carried bodily into the heart of the storm. Come with me into that first upheaval, and see how the young wife was caught up in her father's war. Within months of her wedding, the storm that her marriage had helped to gather broke at last, and Isabelle was swept into it, not as a plotter or a player, but as a wife who must go where her husband went. A daughter who must follow her father's banner, carried along by men and events entirely beyond her control. And I want to hold on to that, her helplessness, as we move into the years of war, for it is easy, telling the great story of risings and battles, to forget the young woman at the edge of it who had chosen none of it and could change none of it, and yet would suffer all of it. Her father and her husband rose against the crown. The details of their rebellion are the stuff of other stories, the manifestos and the marches and the battles, the gathering of discontented men, the clash of armies. What matters for us is what it meant for Isabelle. This woman of perhaps 18, who had been a duchess for a matter of months, and now found her father and her husband in open revolt against the crown. The two men who ruled her life become rebels and traitors in the eyes of the crown. At first, for a time, the rebellion went well. Edward was caught off guard, his forces beaten in the field, and for a moment it seemed that her father might truly master the kingdom, ruling through the sovereign he had defeated, perhaps even setting her husband on the throne. But that first success did not hold, and when her father tried again, the following year, stirring up a fresh rising in the north to unseat the sovereign once more, the gamble failed outright. The king moved faster than they expected, scattered the rebels, and turned upon her father and her husband before they could gather their strength, so that what had been meant as a bold stroke became a headlong flight. Suddenly, they were not conquerors, but fugitives, running for their lives with the king's army at their backs, making for the coast and the ships that were their only escape. Everything collapsed at once. The careful plans, the gathered men, the hopes of mastering the kingdom, all of it dissolving into a desperate scramble for the sea. And in the midst of that scramble, that headlong ruin of all her father's schemes, was Isabelle, far gone with child, swept along in the rout, her body heavy and slow and vulnerable, while the men around her thought only of speed and escape. The rebellion that had begun so grandly with her wedding ended in this. A pregnant girl jolted toward the coast in the wreck of a failed revolt, with nowhere safe ahead of her and the sea. And worse, waiting. Had that come to pass, Isabel would have been raised even higher, the wife of a king, a queen. But it did not come to pass. The wheel that her family rode was always turning, and it turned against them. The king recovered his footing, gathered his strength, and the rebellion that had promised so much began to falter and fail. And here, her father and husband found themselves in a desperate place, for they had risen against their anointed sovereign and lost. And there is no more dangerous thing in the world than to strike at a king and fail to bring him down. They had made themselves traitors, and a traitor's end is a terrible one. And so, their gamble collapsing around them. And Isabel, through all of this, where was she? She was with them, of course, for a wife and daughter went where her men went, and so she was carried along in the wake of the failing rebellion, from triumph to peril to flight, sharing every reverse of her father's fortunes. And there is a detail here that makes her plight far more desperate, far more frightening than that of the men around her, for by this time the duchess was heavily pregnant. She was carrying her first child, far gone toward her time, and she was being dragged across a hostile kingdom in the train of fleeing rebels, her body heavy and vulnerable, her travel hard and dangerous, with enemies behind and an uncertain refuge ahead. The young duchess, who had stood so radiant at her Calais wedding, was now a frightened, pregnant fugitive, fleeing for her life with the men who had brought her to this pass. Think of the fear of it. For her in particular. The men feared for their lives, and rightly, but they were soldiers, used to danger, able at least to fight or to ride hard. She was a pregnant young woman, unable to do anything but endure. Jolted in carriages or carried on litters over bad roads, ill, frightened, exhausted, her child stirring in her, even as her whole world collapsed. She had no power to alter her course, no say in where she was taken, nothing to do but suffer the journey and pray for safety, for herself and for the baby she carried. Every hard mile was a danger to the child within her. Every delay brought the royal soldiers closer, and the refuge they fled toward was no safe haven but the open sea, for the plan, in the end, was to escape by ship, to flee England altogether across the water, and to seek shelter abroad. So the family ran for the coast, and took ship, she among them, great with child, putting out onto the sea in flight from the king's wrath. And it was here, on that desperate voyage, that she would suffer the first and perhaps the cruelest of the many sorrows of her life, for her time came upon her at the worst possible moment, at sea, in flight, with no safe harbour to receive her. What happened to her aboard that ship is one of the most pitiable episodes in the whole of her story, and it is where we must go next, gently, for it is a hard thing to tell. But hold, first, this picture of how she came to it, not through any fault or choice of her own, but carried there helplessly. A pregnant girl swept up in the ruin of her father's rebellion, paying in her own body for the ambitions of the men who owned her fate. Come with me onto that ship, off the coast of Calais, on the worst night of her young life. She was barely 18 and far gone with her first child, when the labour came upon her in the cramped quarters of a ship at sea. I will tell it gently, for it is among the most pitiable passages in all her story, and the wonder is not that it ended in grief, but that she lived through it at all. The family had run for the coast and taken ship, meaning to cross to Calais, to her father's old fortress, the stronghold of her childhood, where they surely thought they would find refuge. But when the ships came at last under the walls of Calais, the gates were shut against them. The garrison that had once been wholly her father's would not let them in, for the fortunes of war had shifted, and those who held the town now feared to shelter rebels fleeing the king's wrath. So the ships lay off the coast, kept out, denied the harbour, while on board one of them a young woman had gone into labour, and there was no midwife, no quiet chamber, no warm bed, no help of the kind a birth required. Only the heaving deck and the cramped quarters and the women of her household doing what little they could. Think of it, if you can bear to, for it is almost unbearable. Isabel, 18 years old, bringing her first child into the world, not in the great curtained bed of a noble house, with physicians and midwives and every comfort, as a duchess should, but on a tossing ship, in flight, with the walls of the refuge she had hoped for, shut against her and the open sea around. The pain and the fear of any first birth, multiplied by the terror of her circumstances, the motion of the vessel, the want of all the things that should have eased her, the knowledge that she and all her family were fugitives with enemies on every side. It is said that some little mercy was shown, that wine was sent out to the ship for the labouring duchess, a small kindness in the midst of the cruelty, but it was little enough against what she was suffering. For the garrison of Calais, which her father had commanded for years and surely trusted to receive him, had turned its coat with the turning fortunes of the war. The men who held the town now answered to the king, or feared to be seen sheltering his enemies, and when her father's ships appeared beneath the walls, they were warned off, refused entry, told they could not land. It was a bitter stroke that the very fortress of Isabel's childhood, the strong place she had been brought to be married in only months before, should now shut its gates against her in her hour of greatest need. They lay off the harbour, denied, while the duchess laboured on board, and it was only after some pleading that even the wine was allowed out to her, sent across the water to a ship that could not come to shore. And then, when the worst had happened and the child was lost, there was nothing to be done but turn away from those closed gates and sail on, down the coast, to seek some other refuge, carrying their grief and their defeat with them. The shutting of Calais against her was the sharpest of the many betrayals that marked Isabel's life, the home of her childhood barring its doors while she lost her firstborn on the sea outside. And the child did not live. Whether it was born already dead, or lived only a short while in that desperate place before slipping away, the accounts do not let us say with certainty, and I will not pretend to a precision the records do not allow. But the baby, Isabel's first child, the child she had carried through all the months of rebellion and flight, did not survive its birth at sea. The young mother, who had endured so much to bring it into the world, was left with empty arms, her labour come to nothing, her firstborn lost before its life had truly begun, and herself weak and grieving and still a fugitive on a hostile sea. There is no sorrow quite like the loss of a first child, and to suffer it so, in flight, in terror, far from home and comfort, denied even a safe place to lie, is a cruelty almost beyond imagining. Isabelle had been given no choice in any of the events that brought her to that ship. She had been married where she was told, carried into rebellion in her husband's train, dragged across the kingdom and out to sea in the ruin of her father's gamble, and now, at the end of it, she had paid for those men's ambitions in the most personal and terrible coin there is, the life of her own child. The men had wagered for a throne. She had lost a baby. That, I think, is the truest measure of what it was to be a daughter and a wife in that age, that the great games of the powerful were paid for, again and again, in the bodies and the griefs of the women bound to them. We do not know how Isabelle bore it, for no one recorded her grief, but we can honour it by feeling it, by refusing to let her loss be only a line in the story of her father's wars. She was a young woman who had lost her first baby in the most frightening way imaginable, and whatever strength or faith carried her through, the wound of it must have stayed with her always. One more sorrow folded into a life that would hold too many, and she had not even the comfort of stopping to mourn, of going home to grieve in peace, for she was still a fugitive, still at sea, still being carried onward into banishment, her family's cause in ruins, no haven anywhere in sight. The loss of her child was not an ending she could pause over, but one more blow in a gathering storm that swept her on without mercy. So they turned from the barred harbour of Calais and sailed on to seek refuge where they could find it, on the coast of France. And she went with them, emptied and grieving, cast out now as well as hunted, her firstborn left behind in the cruel sea. She had begun her marriage as a radiant duchess at a splendid wedding. Within a year, she was a childless, exiled, fugitive girl, mourning a baby born and lost on a ship that could not come to land. That is how fast and how far the wheel had turned for her. And the turning was not finished, for abroad in France, her family would make a new and astonishing alliance, one that would tear at the very heart of Isabel's life. For it would take her beloved sister and marry her to the enemy. Come with me into their banishment, and then to the news that would set the two sisters on opposite sides of the war. After the loss at sea, Isabelle passed into a strange grey chapter of her life, the time of banishment, when she was a duchess with nothing, a great lady cast adrift on a foreign shore, mourning her child and dependent, always, on the decisions of the men who held her fate. It is a quiet stretch of her story, without battles or dramas of its own, but I do not want to hurry past it, for it was in this lingering and this grief that much of who she was must have been forged, and it deserves our attention. The family found refuge at last in France, taken in by the French king, who had his own reasons to shelter the enemies of the English crown. And so Isabelle, who had been raised to the summit of England and married to a prince of the blood, found herself a stranger in a foreign land, dependent on the charity of a foreign court, her family's cause shattered, her husband and her father fugitives, plotting their next move, herself a grieving young woman with no home and no certain future. The foreign king who took them in was a subtle and calculating man, the ruler of France, who sheltered her family not out of kindness, but because their quarrel served his own ends. For anything that weakened the English crown was useful to France, and it was under his eye and with his urging that the great and terrible reconciliation was arranged, the meeting of old enemies that would remake the war. For that subtle monarch brought together, at a town in his realm, Isabel's father and the exiled Lancastrian queen, the two bitterest foes in the long English quarrel, and pressed them to make peace and join their forces against the throne of York. It was an extraordinary scene, the proud earl who had driven the queen into banishment now kneeling, it was said, to beg her pardon and her alliance. The two of them swallowing years of hatred for the sake of a common foe. And out of that hard, unnatural bargain came the marriage that would divide the sisters, for the alliance had to be sealed. And the seal chosen for it was Anne. Isabelle, somewhere in the background of those negotiations, can only have watched the bargaining with a heavy heart, knowing that her family's fortunes and her sister's fate alike were being settled by foreign rulers and old enemies over her head. It was a humbling reversal, the kind her family had always feared, the fall from the very height to dependence and want. And Isabelle lived through it in the rawness of her recent loss, her arms still empty, her first grief still fresh. Picture her in those idle months, in borrowed lodgings on the French coast, far from everything she had known. Gone were the great castles of her childhood, Warwick with its mighty towers, the familiar fortress of Calais. Gone was the security of her rank, for a refugee, however nobly born, lives on sufferance, at the mercy of a host who may tire of the burden. She had her husband, but her husband was a restless, discontented man, brooding on his lost hopes, no comfort to a grieving wife. She had her father, but her father was consumed with his schemes, plotting day and night to recover what he had lost. She had her mother and her sister with her at least, which must have been some solace, the women of the family together, in their banishment. But the warmth of that was shadowed by the cold business the men were about, and by the grief the Duchess carried, and by the deep uncertainty of their whole situation, not knowing whether they would ever go home, ever be restored, ever be anything again but exiles living on a foreign king's charity. And there is a particular loneliness in the position the young woman held in that scattered family, for she was the link between the two men whose alliance was beginning to strain. Her father and her husband had risen together, failed together, fled together, but their union had been one of convenience, not of love. And in the bitterness of defeat and banishment, it was starting to crack. Her father was already thinking of new alliances, new ways back to power, ways that might not include her husband at all. Her husband was beginning to sense that he had wagered everything on her father's cause and lost, and that he might have done better to stay loyal to his brother the king. And the elder daughter stood between them, the wife of the one and the daughter of the other, bound to both, able to do nothing but watch the alliance that was the whole foundation of her marriage begin to come apart. What does a young woman do in such a stretch of waiting and grief and uncertainty? She endures. She keeps the forms of her days as best she can, the prayers, the small duties, the company of her mother and sister. She mourns her child in whatever private way her faith and her nature allowed. She waits on the men's decisions, as she had always waited, for nothing in her life was ever hers to decide. And perhaps, in the long, idle, anxious days abroad, she drew closer to the women around her, to her mother and her young sister Anne, the three of them sharing the strange suspended existence of the dispossessed, the only constant in a world that had collapsed. If there was any comfort for her in that grey time, it must have been in them, the family within the family, the women together, while the men schemed, but that comfort, too, was about to be taken from her, for the new alliance her father was hatching, the desperate stroke by which he hoped to recover everything, would strike at the very heart of the women's circle. To climb back to power, her father was preparing to do a thing that would have seemed unthinkable only a year before, to make peace with his oldest enemy, the Lancastrian queen, whose cause he had spent his life destroying. And to seal that peace, he would need a bride. And the bride he had to offer was Anne, Isabel's own beloved Anne, the younger girl who had shared her wandering and her grief. Anne was to be married to the son of the enemy, the Lancastrian prince. And with that marriage, the two of them who had only ever had each other would be set, at last and irrevocably, on opposite sides of the war. So the grey waiting was about to end, not in the comfort of restoration, but in a stroke that would divide the two girls forever. She had lost her child. Now she was about to lose, in a way, her sister too. Not to death, but to the enemy, handed across the lines of the war, to the very people the family had always fought. How the girl felt about that, watching her little Anne made the bride of the foe, is one of the hardest and most human questions in her whole story, and it is where we must go next. Come with me to the news that broke the pair of them apart. Now I must tell you of the thing that divided the two sisters, and try to bring you Isabel's heart in it, for this is one of the moments where her story turns on a relationship rather than a battle. And it is exactly the kind of moment the chronicles do not record, and we must feel our way toward. Her father, to climb back to power, made an alliance with the old foe, and the price of that alliance was Isabel's sister. Let me set it before you plainly. For years, Isabel's father had been the great champion of one side in the wars, the side of York, the side of the king, her husband's brother. He had fought the House of Lancaster, driven its queen into exile, helped to break its power. The Lancastrian queen, Margaret, was his bitterest foe, a fierce and unyielding woman who had every reason to hate him. for he had done as much as any man to ruin her cause. And now, in his own exile and defeat, Isabel's father turned to that very woman and proposed an alliance, that they should join forces, the old enemies, to bring down the King of York and restore the House of Lancaster, with Isabel's father as the power behind the restored throne. It was a breathtaking reversal, a man making peace with the enemy he had spent his life destroying, and to seal it, to bind the two old foes together, there had to be a marriage. Margaret had a son, the Lancastrian prince, the heir to the cause her father had fought, and Isabel's father had a daughter still unwed, the younger one, Anne. So Anne, Isabel's beloved sister, barely 14 years old, was to be married to the Lancastrian prince, the son of the foe, the heir of the line her family had always fought. The little sister who had shared Isabel's nursery and her exile and her grief was to be handed across the lines of the war, made the bride of the foe, set against the very struggle that consumed them all. And in that moment, the two of them, who had been each other's whole world, who had only ever had one another, were divided as completely as two people could be, for now they were not merely apart but opposed. The wife of the king's brother in one camp, the wife of the king's enemy on the other, their husbands sworn to destroy each other. What did Isabel feel, watching this? We cannot know, but let us think honestly about it, for she was a real woman and not a chess piece. There must have been fear for Anne, surely, the protective elder sister's terror at seeing her little Anne, still a child, married off to a stranger and made a pawn in the deadliest game in the kingdom. Anne was being given to the son of a hard and ruthless woman, sent into a cause that might triumph or might end in slaughter. And Isabel, who had herself been married off and carried into ruin, knew better than anyone what her sister was being made to bear. The elder must have ached for the younger, set on the same hard road she had walked, with even less choice and even less say. But there must have been something more tangled in it too. Something harder to name, for this new alliance was a betrayal of her own position. The whole point of marrying her to Clarence had been to make Clarence king with her father's help, and her a queen. Now her father had abandoned that plan and taken up another one that put a different prince, the Lancastrian boy, married to Anne, in line for the throne instead. In raising up Anne's husband, her father was casting down Isabel's. The younger sister was being made, potentially a future queen, while the elder's royal hopes were thrown away. And so to the fear for Anne was added, perhaps, a bitter tangle of feeling, that her father had sacrificed her husband's cause and her own grand prospects to make her little Anne the greater match. The two girls had never been rivals before. Now their father had made them rivals, set their husbands and their futures against each other, turned the deepest love of her life into a thing shot through with division and competing interests. And worst of all, perhaps, was the helplessness of it, the same helplessness that ran through her whole life. She could not stop it. She could not protect Anne from the marriage, nor protest the casting down of her own husband, nor heal the division being driven between herself and the younger she loved. She could only watch, as she always watched, while the men decided everything, while her father spent her sister as he had spent her, while the one relationship that had been wholly hers was bent and divided to serve his ambition. The bond between the pair of them was not broken. I do not think it could be broken, but it was strained now as never before, stretched across the widening gulf of the war, the two of them loving each other, still, surely, but separated by everything the world could put between two women, by marriage and by faction and by the deadly opposition of their husbands' causes. So the two of them were divided, set in opposing camps of the coming storm, and Isabel could do nothing but grieve the division and fear for them both. And the storm came quickly now, for the new alliance was made, the marriages and the bargains struck, and her father gathered his forces and prepared to return to England, to overthrow the king and restore the dynasty he had once destroyed. The exiles were going home, to victory or to ruin, and Isabel and Anne were going with them, on opposite sides now, into a war that would, within a single dreadful year, kill their father, widow one of them, and shatter everything the family had been. Come with me back across the sea, into the year that brought it all down. The exiles came home, and the war broke open, and almost at once Isabel found herself caught in the most agonizing trap of her whole life, torn between the two men who ruled her. For her husband betrayed her father, and she could do nothing but stand helpless in the middle of it, bound by love and duty to both, able to save neither and to side with neither, without wounding the other. Let me show you how the trap closed. Her father had returned to England in triumph, driving out the king and restoring the old Lancastrian line, and for a brief season it seemed his desperate gamble had paid off, that he was master of the kingdom again. But the sovereign he had driven out did not stay gone. Edward came back, landing in the north with a small force, gathering men as he marched south, and the question that now hung over everything was which way the great lords would turn. And there is a detail in how her husband came to change his coat that touches Isabel's family closely, for the turning of Clarence was not a sudden whim, but the fruit of patient, secret persuasion, and the persuaders were women of his own blood. It was said that his mother and his sisters, grieved to see one son set against another, worked quietly behind the scenes to bring Clarence back to the king, sending messages to him, reasoning with him, reminding him where his true interest and his blood loyalty lay. They pressed upon him the plain truth that he had been used, that in the new Lancastrian order he would never be more than a junior partner, his own hopes of the crown thrown away to make room for the Lancastrian prince, and that he had far more to gain by reconciling with the brother who could forgive and reward him. And the argument told, slowly, secretly, Clarence was won back, his defection arranged in advance through these hidden channels, so that when the armies drew near and he went over to the king, it was no battlefield impulse, but a thing long prepared. Isabel, bound to him, may or may not have known of these secret dealings, but she would live with their result, the public spectacle of her husband abandoning her father at the decisive hour, and the lord whose choice mattered most to Isabel, agonizingly, was her own husband. For Clarence had been the king's brother before he was her father's son by marriage, and now, with the king returned and his own hopes in the new Lancastrian order looking thin, Clarence began to think of changing his coat yet again, of abandoning her father and going back to Edward, the man he had betrayed. And that is exactly what he did. As the armies drew together, Clarence deserted. He took his men and went over to his brother Edward, abandoning her father at the very moment of crisis, when his support might have meant everything. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, for the Earl had made Clarence what he was, had married his daughter to him, had risked everything in the alliance. And now, when it mattered most, Clarence turned his coat and left him to face Edward alone. The man who had been the seal of the alliance became the agent of its ruin, and the marriage that had bound her father and her husband together became, in the end, worth nothing at all. For her husband simply walked away from it when his own interest called. And think where that left her. Her husband had just betrayed her father. The two men to whom she owed all her loyalty were now on opposing sides of the battle that was coming, and her own husband had been the one to break faith. Whatever she felt, she could say nothing, do nothing, for a wife had no power to command her husband or to save her father. She had to watch her husband desert the man who had given her to him, had to know that the betrayal was her husband's doing, had to live as the wife of the man who had abandoned her father to his enemies. There is no more terrible position for a loving daughter and a dutiful wife than to see the one betray the other, and to be bound, helplessly, to them both. Whichever side won the coming battle, Isabel would lose, for if her father won, her husband was a traitor doomed, and if her husband and the king won, her father was a traitor, doomed instead. Her heart was to be broken either way. We do not know what passed between Isabel and Clarence in those days, whether she begged him not to desert her father, whether she raged or wept or kept a frightened silence. We do not know what passed in her own heart, torn between the husband she was bound to and the father she loved. But we can feel the impossibility of it, the cruelty of being made to belong to two men who had become enemies, of being the living link between an alliance that her own husband was tearing apart. She had been married, in the first place, precisely to bind these two men together. Now they were sundered, and she was sundered with them, her loyalties ripped in two, her marriage revealed as the hollow, broken thing it had always secretly been. And there was Anne, too, on the far side of it all. For Anne was married now to the Lancastrian prince, bound to the cause that Isabel's husband had just rejoined Edward to destroy. So the division ran through the whole family, the father and one daughter's husband on the Lancastrian cause, the other daughter's husband on the side of Edward, the two sisters' marriages set against each other. The men all sworn to kill one another in the field. The family that had once stood together at Calais, the two little girls in their nursery, the great Earl and his countess and his daughters, was now torn into warring fragments, its members on opposing sides of a battle that would, within days, begin to destroy them one by one. So she stood in the eye of the storm, betrayed husband, to betrayed father, her loyalties in ruins, able only to wait for the armies to clash and to learn which of the men she loved would be destroyed. And she did not have to wait long. The forces were closing, the great lords had chosen their parties, and the matter would be settled, as such matters always were, in blood, on a field, on a spring morning, when her father and the king met at last in battle. She would not be there to see it. She would only receive afterward the news of what it had cost her. Come with me into the year that brought it all down, and let me tell you, gently, what that year took from her. In the spring of the year 1471, in the space of a few weeks, Isabel's whole world was taken from her. I will not give you the battles, for the clash of armies is not the spirit of our night. And besides, Isabel was not on the field. She did not see the fighting. What she knew of it was only what we will know of it. The news that came afterward, the messengers riding in with word of who had fallen, the slow, dreadful unfolding of how much she had lost. We do not know exactly where Isabel was kept during those terrible weeks, in what house or castle she waited out the ruin of her family. But wherever it was, she waited as women in war have always waited, shut away from the fighting, helpless to effect it, dependent on whatever word reached her. And the word, when it came piecemeal and dreadful, rumour first and then confirmation. The kind of news that arrives in fragments and gathers slowly into catastrophe. First, perhaps the report of a great battle fought in the mist, the outcome uncertain. Then the harder word that her father's side had lost, then, hardening into certainty, the news that her father himself was among the slain. And scarcely had she begun to take in that blow before the second wave of news began to arrive. Of another battle in the west, another defeat, and her sister's young husband dead upon the field. To receive such things at a distance, by report, unable to see or to act, or even to be sure at first whether the news was true, is its own particular torment, the helpless waiting and the slow accumulation of loss. And that was Isabel's portion in the spring of that dreadful year. The messengers riding in, one after another, each with a fresh piece of the ruin of her house. So let us stay with her, where she was, waiting for news, and feel the year as she felt it, not as a sequence of battles, but as a series of wounds. The first blow was her father. On a misty morning in April, the two armies met at last, her father's and the king's, and when the mist cleared, her father was dead. The great Earl, the Kingmaker, the man who had made and unmade kings, who had ruled half of England, who had been the towering figure at the centre of her life, was killed in the battle, cut down in the rout when his cause collapsed. Picture Isabel receiving that news wherever she was kept, the word arriving that her father was slain. The man whose daughter she was, whose greatness had defined her, whose ambition had shaped and spent her, was simply gone, dead on a field she had not seen, and with him died the entire world he had built. But the power and the protection and the towering certainty of his presence. Whatever tangled feelings she had toward him, the father who had used her so hard, he was her father, and he was dead. And his death left her fatherless in the most dangerous moment of her life. And there was a particular bitterness folded into that grief, for her father had been brought down by the side her own husband had joined. Clarence had deserted to the king, and it was the king's victory that killed her father. Isabel could not even mourn cleanly, for the husband at her side belonged to the cause that had slain the father she wept for. She was the widow of no one yet, but she was already caught in the cruel knot of her whole life, grieving a death that her own household had helped to bring about, bound to the winners while she mourned among the losers. The second stroke followed hard upon the first, and it fell upon the sister she loved. For within weeks of her father's death, the other army, her sister's husband's, the cause of Lancaster, was destroyed in its turn, in another battle, and in that ruin, Anne's young husband, the Lancastrian prince, was killed. Anne, barely 15 years old, married only months before, was made a widow, her husband slain, her cause shattered, her new mother by marriage, the fierce defeated queen, taken prisoner. The little sister who had been handed to the enemy as a bride was now a widow before she was a woman, alone, defeated, in the power of the victors. And she, hearing it, must have felt the stroke as if it were her own. The protective elder learning that her little Anne had lost all in a single bloody afternoon. So in the space of a few weeks, the duchess lost her father to one battle and saw her sister widowed by another. The two halves of the divided family both broken at once. The entire structure of her father's ambition collapsing into death and defeat. Everything the family had been was gone. The father was dead. The cause her sister had been married into was annihilated. The mother, as we shall see, fled into hiding. And the two of them, who had been set on opposite sides of the war, were now united again, but only in ruin, both of them robbed in the same season of the men who had defined their lives. The one of her father, the other of her husband, both cast down from the heights into grief and uncertainty. I want you to sit with the weight of that year on her, for it is easy to take it as a list of events and miss what it was to live. She was 19 years old. In the previous 2 years, she had been married into rebellion, carried into flight, lost her first child at sea, endured exile, watched her sister married to the enemy, seen her husband betray her father, and now, in a few weeks, seen that father killed and her sister widowed. Blow upon blow, each one falling on a young woman who had chosen none of it, and could prevent none of it, who could only receive the dreadful news as it came and try to endure. Few lives, even in that hard age, were so battered in so short a time, and she bore it all, as she bore everything, with the helpless endurance that was the only strength her position allowed her. And the year was not even done with its cruelties, For there was a fourth figure in the family whose fate, in the wake of all this ruin, was perhaps the most pitiable of all, and that was the mother, the Countess, Isabel's own mother, who, on hearing of her husband's death and her family's destruction, did the only thing she could think to do, and fled into sanctuary, into hiding, to save her life. And what happened to her there, and Isabel's helplessness to save her, is one of the deepest sorrows of this whole sorrowful story. Come with me to the mother in her sanctuary, and to the daughter who could not reach her. Of all the helpless griefs of Isabel's life, and there were many, none, I think, can have cut deeper than what happened to her mother. For here was a wrong done to someone Isabel loved, done slowly, in plain sight, over years. And Isabel could not stop it, and worse, far worse, she and her husband were among those who profited from it. This is the hardest passage in her story, and I want to tell it with care. For it is a tangle of love and guilt and helplessness that says everything about the trap Isabel lived in. When her father was killed and his cause destroyed, Isabel's mother, the Countess, was left suddenly exposed, the relict of the kingdom's greatest traitor, with no protector and every reason to fear for her life and her lands. So she did what the desperate did in that age. She fled to sanctuary, taking refuge in an abbey, claiming the ancient protection of the church, which held that a fugitive who reached holy ground could not be dragged from it. She shut herself away in that refuge. The once great Countess, mistress of one of the largest fortunes in England, now a frightened woman, hiding in an abbey, waiting to learn whether she would be allowed to live, and how, and on what terms. But here is where the cruelty begins. For the Countess was not merely a widow to be pitied, she was an heiress, and that changed everything. The vast inheritance that had made Isabel and her sister such great prizes came, you remember, through their mother. It was the Countess's own birthright, her lands, her title, the fortune of her ancient line. And now that her husband was slain and disgraced, that enormous inheritance was suddenly within reach of others, and the men who wanted it, the king and his brothers, were not inclined to let her keep it from them. The Countess, alive and praying in her abbey, stood in the way of a great prize, and so a way was found to step around her, to treat her as though she were not there, to take her inheritance while she yet lived. And who were the men who wanted that inheritance? They were Isabel's own husband, Clarence, and his brother, who had married, by now, Isabel's widowed sister, Anne. The two royal brothers had wed the two Neville sisters, and between them they meant to divide the whole vast Neville and Beauchamp fortune, the lands that were, in truth, the living Countess's own. The mother's inheritance was to be carved up between her two sons by marriage, in right of her two daughters, while the mother herself sat shut away in sanctuary, robbed of everything, treated as a cipher, an obstacle to be managed rather than a woman to be honoured. And she was in the middle of it once again, for it was her marriage, her husband, that claimed half the spoils. She was, whether she willed it or not, a party to the despoiling of her own mother. Think what that must have been for her. She loved her mother. We have no reason to doubt it, for the family had been a close one, and the bond between the Countess and her elder daughter was a true one. And now she had to watch, helpless, as her mother was stripped of her birthright and shut away, and to know that her own husband was one of the two men doing the stripping, that her own household, her own marriage, was enriched by her mother's ruin. She could not stop it. A wife had no power over her husband's greed, no voice in the dividing of vast inheritances, no way to defend her mother against the will of princes. She could only watch and grieve and perhaps plead in private to no effect, while the men she was bound to despoiled the woman who had borne her. Whatever guilt she felt, whatever shame, whatever helpless love for the mother she could not protect, she had to carry it in silence, the dutiful daughter who profited, against her will, from her own mother's undoing. And the worst of it, the very worst, was still to come, for the despoiling of the Countess would not stop at the seizing of her lands. There was a further cruelty being prepared, stranger and colder than mere robbery, a thing that would use the law itself to wrong her. But that belongs to the next part of our story, and I will not run ahead of it. For now it is enough to feel Isabel's helplessness, watching from a distance, as her mother was stripped and shut away, and able to do nothing at all. This, then, is the second great helplessness of Isabel's existence, after the helplessness over her sister. The helplessness over her mother, the inability to protect the woman who bore her from the greed of the man she was married to. Her two deepest loves, her sister and her mother, were both being used and wronged by the great forces around her, and in both cases she could do nothing at all, but watch and grieve. That, more than any single event, is the shape of Isabel's story, the loving, dutiful daughter and sister who could save no one. Bound and silent while the people she loved were spent and broken by the men who held all the power. But there were, in the midst of all this sorrow, some years of relative calm and even happiness coming for her. The years of her own household and her own children, and to those gentler years we will turn next. For she deserves to be seen in her brief seasons of peace as well as in her griefs. Come with me into the quieter chapter of her life. I told you that the cruelty done to Isabel's mother would deepen, and now I must tell you how, for it is one of the strangest and most chilling acts of that whole hard age. And Isabelle lived the rest of her short life in its shadow, eating, in a sense, the bread of her own mother's dispossession. The men who wanted the Countess's inheritance found a way to take it utterly, not by killing her, for she had done no crime, but by a far stranger device. They had her declared, by the law itself, to be already dead. Think on the cold ingenuity of it. The Countess was alive. She had fled to sanctuary, broken no law, harmed no one. She was simply a widow with a great fortune that powerful men coveted. They could not lawfully seize a breathing woman's inheritance while she lived to hold it. So they arranged, through an act of Parliament, that she should be treated in law as though she were naturally dead, her inheritance passing to her heirs exactly as it would if she had died and been buried. The living woman was legally erased. On parchment, she ceased to exist. Her lands flowed to her daughters and their husbands, as a dead woman's lands flow to her heirs. And the Countess herself, praying and grieving in her sanctuary, became a kind of ghost. A person the law had pronounced gone while her heart still beat. And the Countess did not go quietly into that legal grave. She knew what was being done to her, and she fought it with the only weapons a powerless woman had, with words, with pleas, with petitions. She wrote, and she begged, and she sent her appeals to those she thought might help her, protesting that she was alive, that the inheritance was hers, that this thing being done to her was monstrous and unjust. She petitioned the great. She appealed to the Queen. She cried out as loudly as a shut-away widow could cry against her own erasure, and it availed her nothing. The men who profited from her legal death were far more powerful than any plea she could make, and they were royal princes, the king's own brothers, and against such men a widow's protests were as nothing. Her appeals were set aside. The act stood. She remained, in the eyes of the law, dead. What made the thing so shocking, even to that hard age, was that it broke with all custom and decency. A widow's right to her own inheritance was one of the surest things in the law. Her lands were hers, and no one, however powerful, was supposed to be able simply to take them while she lived. To get around that ancient right, the men who wanted the Countess's fortune had to reach for an extraordinary device, a special act of the highest authority in the land, bending the whole machinery of Parliament to the single purpose of pretending that a living woman was dead. It was a precedent so dangerous that thoughtful men must have shuddered at it, for if a great lady could be erased by law at the wish of those who coveted her property, then no one's rights were safe. And it was done, not by some distant tyrant, but by the king and his own brothers, the highest men in the realm, the very people whose duty it was to uphold the law, twisting it instead to serve their greed. That her own daughters' husbands were the chief gainers only deepened the wrong, and bound Isabel the more tightly into a guilt she had no way to escape. For the law that erased her mother enriched her own house, and now hold the unbearable part of it for Isabel's sake, for this is her chapter, and not only her mother's. The men who did this thing were Isabel's husband and her sister's husband. The inheritance that was stripped from the living countess was divided between the two royal brothers in right of their two wives, Isabelle and Anne, which means that Isabel and her beloved sister were the very heirs into whose hands their mother's stolen birthright flowed. She did not do the deed. She had no power to do or undo anything, but she profited from it. The lands she held as a duchess, the wealth that surrounded her, the very ground beneath her feet, came to her through her mother's legal murder, through the pretense that her own mother, alive, was dead. She ate and dressed and kept her household on her mother's stolen inheritance, while her mother prayed in a sanctuary, erased. What that did to the duchess inside we cannot know, for she left us no word of it. But I cannot believe it sat easily on a woman who, by all we can tell, loved her mother. To live in wealth that is your own mother's stolen birthright. To know that your own comfort rests on her erasure. To be unable either to refuse the spoils or to restore them to her. That is a particular kind of slow torment, a guilt with no outlet, a wrong you are part of and cannot put right. Every fine gown, every good dinner, every comfort of her great estate must have carried for a thoughtful and tender woman the faint bitter taste of where it came from. She was made against her will, a beneficiary of the cruelest thing done to the person she loved, and she had to live with that, in silence, with no way to make it right. It is one more turn of the same screw that ran through all of Isabel's life, the screw of helpless complicity, of being bound to powerful men whose deeds she could not prevent, and from which she could not separate herself. She could not save her sister from being married to the enemy. She could not save her father from the consequences of his ambition. She could not save her mother from being declared dead and despoiled. And worse, she was made one of the heirs who took the spoils. Again and again, the people the young woman loved were wronged by the forces around her, and again, she was not merely a helpless witness, but, against her will, a part of the wrong, enriched by her mother's loss. Bound to the men who did it, there is no harder place to stand than that, to love someone, to see them wronged, and to be yourself, however unwillingly, among those who profit from the wrong. So she passed into the settled years of her marriage, the years of household and children, carrying this unspoken weight, living on her mother's lands while her mother lived on, erased, in sanctuary. But those settled years also held real sweetness, the sweetness of her own home and her own children. And I do not want to give you only the sorrow. Before we come to the brightness, though, there is one more strain upon the sisters to tell, for in these same years the bond between the elder daughter and Anne was tested by a bitter quarrel between their husbands, a quarrel that pulled the two of them in opposite directions once again. Come with me to the strange story of the sister the Duchess could not reach. In the years after the great battles, when the dust had settled and the House of York sat secure again upon the throne, the two sisters found themselves caught in a new and painful struggle, not of swords this time, but of greed and law. A quarrel between their own husbands that pulled at the bond between them and left Isabel once more. Reaching for a sister she could not quite touch. And at the heart of it was a story so strange that it has come down the centuries as one of the oddest tales of the age, though we must hold it lightly. For it rests on slender evidence. Here was the situation. Anne, Isabel's sister, was a widow now, her young Lancastrian husband killed, and she was also, like Isabel, a great heiress, for the two sisters were the joint heirs to their mother's enormous inheritance. And so Anne, young and widowed and immensely rich, was a prize that more than one man wanted. The king's youngest brother, the Duke of Gloucester, the one we now remember as Richard, set out to marry her. And there were reasons enough for the match, perhaps even affection, for the two had known each other as children. But her husband, Clarence, did not want that marriage at all, and his reason was naked greed. For as long as Anne was unmarried, or married to no one who could press her claim, Clarence might hope to keep the whole of the vast inheritance in his own hands through Isabel. If Anne married Gloucester, that inheritance would have to be divided, half going to the younger duke, and so Clarence set himself to prevent his sister-in-law's marriage by any means he could. And here is the strange tale. It was said, by one of the chroniclers of the time, that Clarence, to keep Anne from being married to his brother, hid her. That he concealed the young widow, his own wife's sister, somewhere in the city of London, disguised, it was said, as a kitchen servant, a girl among the pots and the smoke, so that Gloucester should not be able to find her and claim her. Whether it is wholly true, this picture of a duke's daughter and a prince's widow hidden among the scullions, we cannot be certain. For it comes to us from a single source and may have grown in the telling. But something of the kind seems to have happened, some hiding away, some concealment of Anne by Clarence to keep her and her inheritance under his control. And the story, true or embroidered, tells us something real about the lengths to which Isabel's husband would go, and the way the two of them had become mere counters in their husband's struggle over land. Now think where this left her. Her own husband was hiding her sister. The man she was married to was holding Anne, concealing her, treating her as a thing to be kept from a rival, all to grasp at lands that were, in bitter truth, their mother's. And Isabel, who loved Anne more than anyone in the world, was bound to the very man who was using her so. Did the Duchess know where Anne was hidden? Did she help to hide her, or try to help her escape, or plead with her husband to let her sister go? We cannot know. The records are silent on her part in it entirely, but we can feel the agony of her position, caught yet again between the husband she was bound to and the younger she loved, her husband's greed reaching out to seize and conceal the very person the young woman most wanted to protect. It is possible, I suppose, that she was complicit, that she went along with her husband's scheme, even that she too wished to keep the whole inheritance and resented her sister's claim. People are not always good, even to those they love, and the lure of so vast a fortune has corrupted gentler souls than her. But I do not think it, somehow. Everything we can sense of her suggests a woman whose deepest loyalty was to her sister, and I find it far easier to imagine her grieved and helpless in the face of her husband's actions than gladly party to them. I imagine her torn, as she was always torn, unable to defy her husband, unable to abandon her sister. Caught in the cruel middle ground that was the whole geography of her life. But the truth is, we do not know, and I will not pretend to a certainty the records do not give. However it was, the matter ended as such matters did, with the powerful getting their way. Gloucester found Anne, or she was given up, and he took her out of Clarence's keeping and into sanctuary, and in time he married her, and the great inheritance was divided between the two royal dukes, half and half, in right of the two girls. Clarence had to yield, and the quarrel between the dukes, bitter and prolonged, was patched up at last by the king. It had been an ugly business while it lasted, and it had reached up to the very top of the kingdom, for the king himself had been forced to step in and mediate between his two squabbling brothers, dividing the vast inheritance between them as a father might divide a disputed toy between two greedy children. The settlement that was reached gave each duke a share, Clarence keeping a great part of the lands in right of the elder daughter, the younger duke taking his portion in right of Anne, and the king keeping the peace between them by main force of his authority. But the bitterness did not wholly die. Clarence, who had wanted everything, never quite forgave the loss of the half that went to his rival, and the grudge festered in him, one more grievance added to the long list of resentments that his restless, dissatisfied nature was forever compiling. And all of it, every bitter word of the quarrel, was carried on over the heads of the two women whose mother's inheritance it was, Isabel and Anne, who were treated throughout, not as people with feelings and loyalties of their own, but as the channels through which the precious lands flowed to their husbands. The pair of them were the reason for the quarrel and had no voice in it. The prizes over which the men contended, present everywhere in the lawyers' arguments, and nowhere in the reckoning of what they themselves might want or feel. And the two of them, the Duchess and Anne, ended on the far sides of it, their husbands' rivals, their lives shaped once more by a struggle over their mother's lands, in which neither sister had any real voice. And yet, and this is the thing I want you to hold, the bond between them seems to have survived even this. For all that their husbands quarrelled, for all that they were set against each other by the endless business of the inheritance, the two of them remained, I believe, sisters still. Two women who had only ever truly had each other, bound by a love that the men's greed could strain but not destroy. We will see, before the end, how that love endured, how Anne would prove herself a true sister to Isabel's memory and to Isabel's children when the time came. But that is for later. For now, let us leave the sad business of the quarrel and turn to the gentler years, to Isabel's own home, her own household, the brief settled season of her life, for she had one, and she deserves to be seen in it. Come with me into the Duchess's house. Let us turn now with some relief to the gentler years, for after all the storms, Isabel had a season of relative calm, the settled middle of her short years, when she lived as a Grand Duchess in her own establishment, mistress of a noble household, and passed her days in the ordered round of a high lady's keeping. It was the longest stretch of peace she would know, and though it was shadowed, as everything in her life was shadowed, it held real comfort. And I want you to see her in it, settled and busy, and I hope sometimes happy. By now the wars had quieted. The House of York sat secure, her husband reconciled for the time to his brother the king. And Isabel was the Duchess of Clarence, one of the first ladies in the land, mistress of vast estates and many houses scattered across the kingdom. A high noblewoman in that age presided over a world in miniature, for a noble household was a small realm of its own, with scores of servants, its own officers and order, its own rhythms and rituals, and the lady of the household stood at the centre of it, responsible for its smooth and dignified running. Picture Isabel in that role, moving through the chambers of one of her fine residences, ordering her servants, overseeing the provisioning and the hospitality, receiving guests, keeping the state that her rank required. The round of such a household was lived to a stately and unhurried rhythm. There were the high chambers hung with rich tapestry, warmed by their fires, where the Duchess kept her state. There were the meals, taken with ceremony, the food brought in with form and served on fine ware. There were the duties of hospitality, for a noble household was always receiving visitors, kinsfolk, retainers, men of business, and the lady must see them fed and lodged and honoured according to their degree. There were the long tasks proper to a noblewoman, the needlework, the management of her women, the keeping of accounts, the giving of alms to the poor who came to her gate. And winding through all of it, framing every day, were the observances of religion, for a high lady's days were devout, ordered around the hours of prayer. For Isabel, like all women of her age and rank, was deeply religious, and her faith was not a mere formality, but the very frame of her days. She would have heard Mass daily, very likely more than once. She would have kept the fasts and the feasts of the church. She would have had her own chaplain, her own chapel, her own books of devotion. In an age of so much loss and uncertainty, religion was the deep consolation, the one sure thing. And for a woman who had endured what Isabel had endured, the loss of a child, the ruin of her family, the long catalogue of griefs, faith must have been a deep refuge. We may picture her at her prayers, in the quiet of her chapel, finding there a peace the rest of her years so rarely gave, laying her sorrows before God, drawing what strength she could from the one constant that the turning wheel could not overthrow. And it was a household, too, that was beginning, at last, to know the sound of children, for in these settled years, Isabel's long-thwarted motherhood came good. We will come to her children properly, in their own place, for they deserve it. Here it is enough to picture the great ordered house no longer only a place of state and ceremony, but in these years a place with a nursery in it, warmed by the small ordinary life that even the grandest household holds when there are little ones beneath its roof. There is something poignant in this settled season, knowing how short it was to be. For these were the only truly peaceful years the young woman had, the only stretch of her life not dominated by war or flight or fresh catastrophe. The years when she could simply be a great lady in her own halls, keeping her estate, raising her children, saying her prayers. After a childhood shadowed by her father's dangerous ambition, after a young womanhood of rebellion and exile and grief, she came at last into a few years of calm, and then those years too would be cut short. For she was not to be granted old age or even middle age, but would die young in the midst of this settled time, before she had truly had her fill of it. So these were precious years, the more precious for being so few, and I am glad to be able to give them to you, the picture of her at peace, or as near to peace as her life ever came, mistress of her household, mother of her children, mistress of her own ordered days. But there was a spot that drew her, beyond her houses and her estates, a place bound up with her family and her faith, and in the end, with her death. And I should like to show it to you before we turn to her children, for it is where her story comes to rest. It was an abbey, an ancient and beautiful church, where her own ancestors lay, and where she herself would one day be laid. Come with me to Tewkesbury, the abbey that would hold her. Tewkesbury, let the name settle softly, for the place it names stood at the very centre of her story in a quiet way, the still point toward which her whole short life was, though she could not know it, always tending. It rose in the west of England, in the green country watered by the Severn, a house of prayer already old when Isabel was born, and bound to her by the oldest and deepest of ties, the tie of blood. Tewkesbury Abbey was, and is, one of the most beautiful abbeys in England, a vast and noble building of pale stone, with a mighty tower and broad rounded pillars marching down its nave, raised centuries before her day and grown rich and splendid under the patronage of the lords who held the lands about it. And those lords, across the generations, had been Isabel's own forebears, her mother's line, the line from whom the vast inheritance descended. For the abbey was the burial church of that ancient line, where its lords and ladies were laid to rest under the stone floor and in fine tombs along the aisles, generation after generation. So that to walk in Tewkesbury was to move among Isabel's ancestors, the long descent of blood through which all her wealth and consequence flowed. This mattered, in that age, more than we can easily feel now. A great house's burial abbey was a sacred trust, a place of memory and prayer, where the living came to honour their dead and to pray for their souls, and where, in due time, the living would themselves be laid beside their forefathers. To be buried among one's ancestors, in the abbey they had endowed and beautified, was a deep comfort and a deep duty, a way of belonging to something that outlasted any single life. The long, unbroken chain of the house stretching back into the past and on into the future. And Tewkesbury was that holy ground for Isabel's mother's line, the consecrated earth that held her people, where the dead of her blood awaited the resurrection. So when we picture Isabel's faith, her deep and sustaining religion, we should set it against this background, the sense of belonging to an ancient house with its own holy ground, its own dead to pray for, its own claim on the mercy of God. She would have known Tewkesbury, would have understood it as her family's church, would have felt, I think, the particular pull such a place exerts. The pull of the ground that holds your ancestors, and that will one day hold you. For a woman as devout as Isabel, the thought of resting at last among her own people in that vast and beautiful abbey under the prayers of its monks must have been a consolation amid all the uncertainties of her days. One fixed and holy anchor in a world that had taken so much from her. And there was a darker recent memory clinging to Tewkesbury too, for it was near that abbey, only a few years before, that one of the battles of the wars had been fought. The very clash in which Isabel's sister's husband had been killed, and the Lancastrian cause destroyed. The abbey had seen the bloody aftermath of that day, had been touched by the violence that swept through the region. So Tewkesbury held for Isabel both the long peace of her ancestors' tombs and the recent horror of the war that had ruined her family, the sacred and the terrible bound together in one place, as so much in her life was bound together, the beauty and the blood inseparable. But it is as a place of rest that I want you to hold Tewkesbury, for that, in the end, is what it would become for her. When her short life ended, as it soon would, it was here that she would be brought home at last to the church of her blood. We will stand in this place again at the close and see her laid to rest. For now it is enough to know that the abbey was waiting. It is a strange peace to think of Isabel come to rest there, in the one ground that was holy and anciently her family's, after a course that had given her so little peace anywhere else. I wanted you to see the abbey now, before we come to her death, so that when we reach the end, you will know where she was going, the beautiful abbey that waited to receive her, the goal toward which her whole brief and troubled course was always, unknowing, on its way. But the end is not yet, for there were, before it, the brightest years she would know, the years when her nursery filled at last with living children. And to those children, the daughter and the son who were the joy of her short life, we turn now with gladness. Come with me to the birth of Isabel's daughter, and to the happiest passage of her story. Now we come to the brightest passage in Isabel's whole story, the part I have most been looking forward to telling you. For after all the loss and the grief, after the baby lost at sea and the weary years of war and exile, Isabel became, at last, a mother to children who lived. In the settled middle of her marriage, in those few calm years, she bore a daughter, and the coming of that child must have been, for a woman who had suffered as Isabel had suffered, a joy almost too deep for words. Think what that birth meant to her. Her first child had died, born in terror on a fleeing ship, lost before its days began, and that wound had never healed and never would. Through all the years since, the longing for a living child must have been with her, the deep ache of a young woman who had been left empty-handed at the very start of her motherhood. And now, in the peace of her own household, in a proper chamber with proper care, attended as a duchess should be attended, with midwives and women, and every comfort. Isabel was brought to bed again, and this time the child lived. A daughter was born, healthy and whole, and they named her Margaret, and Isabel held at last the living child she had longed for through all her griefs. I wish I could tell you the little things. The look on Isabel's face when they laid the baby against her, the words she spoke, the tears she surely wept. But those things were never written down, for the private joys of women, even high-born women, were beneath the notice of the chroniclers, who marked only births that mattered to the succession and passed over the ordinary miracle of a mother and her child. So we must imagine it, and we should, for it is one of the few unshadowed joys in Isabel's years, and she has earned our imagining of it. Picture the Duchess in her wide-curtained bed, the danger of the birth safely past, the baby real and warm against her, and on her grave, careful face, for once, an unmixed happiness. The simple, total joy of a mother who has waited and lost much, and now holds her living daughter in her arms. And this daughter, this Margaret, would matter far beyond the bounds of Isabel's short life, though she could not have known it. For the baby girl born to her then would grow up to live a long and remarkable, and, in the end, a tragic life of her own, surviving into a later age, becoming a great lady, a countess in her own right, honoured and respected, and meeting at the last, in extreme old age, a cruel and violent death at the hands of a king the Duchess never lived to see. But all that lay far in the future, undreamed of, on the day her mother first held her. On that day she was simply a baby, Isabel's longed-for daughter, the living proof that joy was still possible, even in a course so battered. And we should let mother and daughter have that day, bright and unclouded, before any of the future came to pass. It is one of the quiet ironies of Isabel's story that this daughter, born in such happiness, and so soon to be left motherless, would carry her mother's blood the furthest of all into the years to come. The little girl would survive into a far later age, long after the world of her parents had passed away, and grow into a great and dignified lady, raised at last to a title in her own right, honoured and respected through her years, and then, in her old age, when she must have thought all danger far behind her, that same royal blood that had made her grand would turn on her, and a king of a new and ruthless line would send her, an old woman of noble birth, to a brutal death, one of the cruelest acts of a cruel reign. But all of that was 3 generations of trouble away, undreamed of and unimaginable, on the day the young woman first held her daughter. I tell it to you only because it is part of the lingering shadow of Isabel's story. The way the dangerous greatness of her blood reached forward, through her children, into sorrows she would never see. On the day of the birth itself, there was only joy, a mother and her living daughter. And we should leave the shadow there at the edge, and let the joy hold the centre. For the elder daughter, the coming of Margaret must have changed the entire texture of her days. A childless noble house, however grand, has an emptiness at its heart. A house with a child in it is transformed. Now there was a nursery, a fresh new soul to be watched over, the tender apparatus of infant care. The nurses and the rockers and the cradle, the little sounds and small wants that fill a household with a new kind of meaning. She, who had so much love to give, and had been so thwarted in the giving of it, had now a daughter to lavish it upon, and we may imagine her bending over the cradle, watching the baby sleep, holding her, delighting in her, finding in this small person a happiness that all her rank and wealth had never been able to give her. And it gave her, too, a new place in her own family, for now she was not only a daughter and a sister and a wife, but a mother. After so many years of being acted upon, married off, carried into exile, robbed of her first child, here at last was something she had done, someone she had made, a living child of her own body to love and to raise. For a woman who had been so long a pawn in other people's hands, that must have been a deep and steadying joy, the joy of a life that was, in this one room at least, her own. So these were good days, the best she would know, the Duchess with her living daughter, her household warmed at last by a child. And they would soon grow better still, for Margaret was not to be alone. Within a couple of years, the Duchess would bear again, and this time the child would be a son, the heir that every noble house most desired, and the family would be complete, mother and father, daughter and son, at the very summit of Isabel's brief happiness. Come with me to the birth of that son, and to the fullest, gladdest moment of her whole story, before the shadows gathered for the last time. A little under 2 years after Margaret, the second of her living children was born, and this one was a boy. For a son was the thing above all that a noble marriage existed to produce. The son who would carry the name and the lands and the blood into the next generation. And in giving her husband a healthy son, Isabel did the highest thing a wife of her age could do, and crowned the gladdest years of her life. They named the boy Edward, and his coming completed the close circle of Isabel's joy. Now there were 2 living children in the nursery, a daughter and a son. The girl, a toddling child by the season, her brother came. The boy, the longed-for child. Picture the household now, no longer the grand empty shell of state it had been, but a true family hearth with 2 small children in it, the nursery busy and warm, the Duchess a mother twice over, her arms and her days full at last of the children she had so long been denied. And this small boy, this Edward, was a person of high consequence from the moment of his birth, far more than his mother can have wished for him. For he carried in his veins the blood of 2 mighty streams. Through his father he was of the royal house, a nephew of the king, close to the throne. Through his mother he was the heir to that vast and ancient inheritance. The lands and the title that came down through the countess and through Tewkesbury and all those tombs, he was, this child in the nursery, one of the chief heirs of England, born to wealth and rank almost beyond reckoning, a child over whom, even in his cradle, the calculations of the powerful must already have begun to turn. But to Isabel he was simply her son, her boy, the heir of her body, the crown of her motherhood, and we may be sure she loved him not for his grand prospects, but for himself, as mothers do. And like his sister, this boy too would carry his mother's fate-laden blood forward into a hard future. He was, by the line of his birth, one of the nearest of all the children of the realm to the throne itself, and that nearness, which looked in his cradle like the greatest of gifts, would prove in the end a sentence of doom. For in the suspicious years that came after, when new men held the crown and feared any rival claim, a boy of such royal descent was a danger merely by existing, and he would spend much of his short life shut away, a prisoner of his own blood, and die young at the hands of a king who could not afford to let him live. The bright heir in the nursery, the longed-for son, was born already shadowed by the very greatness that should have been his glory. But Isabel, holding her boy in those settled years, could not see any of that, and we should be glad she could not, and let her have her son in the simple gladness of his birth, the heir of her body, the crown of her motherhood, before the long cruelty of the world reached out for him. Let us linger here, in this good place, for it is the summit of Isabel's life, and she reached so few summits. Set aside, for a moment, all that you know is coming, and let her have this. She was a grand duchess, mistress of vast estates, first among the ladies of the land. Her husband, for all his faults, was reconciled with the king and high in the world. Her household was rich and ordered and secure, and in her nursery were 2 living children, a daughter and a son. healthy and thriving, the joy of her heart and the future of her line. After the lost child, after the war, after the exile and the grief and the long catalogue of sorrows, she had come, at last, into a season of real happiness, with everything a woman of her age could have wished for gathered around her, wealth and rank and a husband, above all, her children. For a brief while, the wheel that had turned so cruelly against her seemed to have come to rest at the top. I find a particular sweetness and a particular sadness in dwelling on this moment, because it was so brief and because she had earned it so hard. She was a young woman still, not much past 20, who had already endured more than most people endure in a long lifetime. And now, for once in her hard course, life was being kind to her. She had her babies. She had her household. She had, perhaps, some measure of peace in her marriage. For even Clarence, restless and dangerous as he was, may have been gentled for a season by the settled years and the coming of his children. We do not know that she was happy. We cannot see into her heart across the centuries. But we can see the shape of her circumstances, and the shape of them, in these years, was as fortunate and as full as her life ever became. And I choose to believe that she knew some real happiness in them, that she had, at last, some good and golden season. But I cannot keep the shadow off for long, because the truth is that this happiness was almost done. She did not know it, bending over her children's cradles in those bright years, but she had very little time left. She would conceive once more, and that final childbearing would be the end of her, for her body, worn perhaps by all she had endured, or struck by the diseases that carried off so many young women in that age, would not survive it. The summit she had reached, the duchess with her 2 children and her settled estate, was a narrow peak, and the ground fell away sharply on the other side. Within a short while of her son's birth, she would be carrying her last child and sliding toward an early death, and the bright young family gathered in the nursery would be broken. The mother taken from the children she had longed for and loved so well. So let us hold the summit a moment longer, the picture of her at the height of her brief happiness, the duchess and her daughter and her son. She had climbed, through so much sorrow, to this small, bright peak, and she deserved to stay there, and she could not. The ground was about to fall away beneath her. Come with me, gently, down the far side of it, into the final passage of her story. Before we follow Isabel down into her last winter, I want to bring the 2 sisters together one more time in these settled years, for they were both grown women now, both duchesses, both mothers, their girlhood far behind them, and the bond between them, strained and stretched by all that the world had done, still held. It is worth pausing on the 2 of them, side by side at the height of their lives, the elder and the younger, the daughters of Warwick, before the end takes the elder away. Consider how their lives had run in parallel, and how strangely. They had been born of the same parents, raised in the same nursery, the 2 great heiresses of the same vast fortune. They had both been married by men's design to royal dukes, brothers of each other, sons of the House of York. She had wed the elder brother Clarence. Anne, after the death of her first husband, had wed the younger Gloucester. So the 2 of them were now sisters twice over, sisters by blood and sisters by marriage. Each the wife of the other's brother-in-law, their husbands not only kinsmen, but rivals. And each sister was now a mother, Isabel with her daughter and her son, Anne with a son of her own, so that their children were double cousins, bound by the same double ties that bound their mothers. Anne's boy, her only child, was a son too, a little cousin to Isabel's children, and for a while it must have seemed that the next generation of the family was secure. 3 small children of the 2 girls growing up to inherit, between them, all the greatness of the house. They were a tightly knotted little group, those cousins. Their kinship doubled and redoubled, for through their mothers they were first cousins by blood, and through their fathers, who were brothers, they were first cousins again, so that the same few drops of blood ran round and round the small circle of them. In a happier world they might have grown up together, the children of the two duchesses, playmates and companions bound by all those ties, the family's sorrows healing in the next generation. But the world was not happy, and it would not let the cousins grow up in peace, for the same deadly greatness that flowed in their veins, the royal and noble blood that made them so grand, would mark them out, every one, for hard and early fates. The bright little knot of cousins gathered in the nurseries of the two sisters was, though no one could yet see it, a gathering of victims, children whose very blood was a danger to them. It is a remarkable symmetry. The two Neville sisters wedded to the two royal brothers, the two halves of the great inheritance held by the two couples. The two nurseries filling with the cousins who were the future of it all. And it might have been a happy thing, the two girls settled near the summit of the kingdom, their children growing up together, the family reunited after all its sorrows. But it was shadowed, as everything in their lives was shadowed, by the rivalry of their husbands, who could not quite leave off quarrelling over the lands, and by the long memory of all that had divided them. The war that had set them on opposite sides, the bitter business of their mother's inheritance, the strain of the years when Isabel's own husband had hidden Anne away. And yet, through all of it, I believe the two sisters remained sisters. The chroniclers do not tell us of their meetings, of the words that passed between them, of whether they were close in these years, or kept apart by their husbands' quarrels. The private life of two women, even two duchesses, was beneath the notice of those who wrote the histories. But I find it very hard to believe that the bond forged in that shared nursery, the devotion of the two girls who had only ever had each other, was simply undone by the schemes of the men they married. Strained, surely. Complicated, certainly, by rivalry and distance and the endless business of the lands. But broken, I do not think so. I think that somewhere beneath the quarrels of their husbands, the two girls remained what they had always been. The two daughters of Warwick, bound by a tie that the world could bend but not break. And there is a piece of evidence, of a kind, for that enduring bond, though it lies in the future, beyond her death. For when the worst came, and Isabel's children were left with no one, it was Anne who would gather them up and keep them. We will come to that act of faith at the very end, in its proper place. I mention it here only because it tells us, looking backward, what must have lain between the sisters all along. You do not take in your sister's orphans and raise them beside your own for a woman you had ceased to love. So let us hold this picture, the two duchesses, the two daughters of Warwick, grown women now with children of their own, bound by blood and marriage and a love that had survived war and division and the greed of the men who owned them. They had come through so much together and apart, the two girls from the nursery at Warwick, and now they stood, briefly, at the height of their lives, near the summit of the kingdom, their futures, it might have seemed, secure at last. But the wheel was about to turn one final time for the elder sister, and turn cruelly. For Isabel had less than no time left, though no one knew it. She would conceive once more, and her body, worn by all it had borne, would not survive the bearing, and the elder of the two duchesses, who had endured so much, would die young, leaving her sister behind to keep faith with her children. That turn of the wheel is where we must go now. The settled years were ending, though no one in that secure and prosperous household could have guessed how soon. Come with me into her last winter. In the last full year of her days, Isabel conceived again her fourth child, and this final childbearing would be the end of her. I will tell it gently and without false drama, for it is the quiet, ordinary tragedy that ended so many young women's lives in that age. The tragedy of the childbed, and Isabel, for all her rank and wealth, was as helpless before it as the poorest woman in the land. She had borne 3 children by now. The first, lost at sea, had broken her heart at the very start. The second and third, her daughter and her son, had lived and given her joy. And now she was carrying a fourth, and we may imagine her, in the months of that last pregnancy, hopeful still, perhaps, looking forward to another child to join the 2 who filled her nursery, not knowing, as no one could know, that this was the pregnancy that would kill her. In the autumn her time came, and she was brought to bed and bore another son. They named him Richard. It was the autumn of the year 1476, in October, that this last child was born. And the poor baby's hold on the world was as frail as his mother's was becoming, for he would not live out the following winter. Within a few months he too would be dead, an infant who barely outlasted the mother who bore him. So this final childbearing, the one that ended Isabel's days, brought into the world a child who would himself so soon follow her into the grave. The 2 of them, mother and last son, dying within weeks of each other in that one black season. It is among the saddest passages of all her sad story that her dying should have been bound up with a birth that itself came to nothing. The child she gave her life to bear, surviving her by so little. And it deepens the pity of those last weeks, for as Isabel lay declining through the autumn and into the winter, there was a newborn in the house, whose own grip on the world was failing. The 2 of them, the worn-out mother and the fading infant, sinking together while the household watched, helpless, the ordinary murderous arithmetic of childbed in that age playing itself out in the highest family in the land, just as it did in the poorest cottage. He was born, it seems, at the Abbey of Tewkesbury, the very church of her ancestors, the holy ground of her line, as though her family's story were drawing all its threads together toward that one place. But something was wrong with her after this birth. Whether it was the birth itself that broke her, the childbed fever that carried off so many women in the days and weeks after their deliveries, the infection that the medicine of the age could neither prevent nor cure, or whether it was some other illness, a consumption, a wasting sickness, that had been working in her for some time and was now hastened by the strain of the childbearing, we cannot say with certainty. The records do not let us name her disease, and I will not pretend to a diagnosis the centuries cannot give. But whatever it was, after the birth of her last son Isabel did not recover. She lingered ill, declining, through the late autumn and into the winter, her strength ebbing, her body failing, the young duchess, who had borne so much now, sinking slowly toward her death. Think of that winter, gently, for her. She was a young woman, not yet 26, who had at last come into some happiness, her household, her children, her settled estate, and now she lay ill, fading, knowing perhaps that she was dying, with so much she would be leaving behind. She had a daughter of 3 and a son of not yet 2, the children she had longed for through all her griefs and had so little time to enjoy. And now she must leave them, motherless, while they were still so small. She had a newborn baby too, the last son, himself frail and not long for the world. And she had her sister somewhere, and her erased mother, still living, shut away. All of it she must leave. Sliding out of her young world in the cold of that winter, worn out at 25, by a fate that had asked far too much of her. We do not know how she faced it, for no one recorded her dying, but we can hope, and even believe, that her faith was a comfort to her at the last. She was a devout woman, raised to think on her soul and to trust in the mercy of God and the life to come, and in that age the approach of death was met with the rites and prayers of the Church, the confession, the last sacraments, the commending of the soul into God's hands. We may picture her in her last days, in her chamber, attended by her women and her priest, making her peace, saying her prayers, preparing her soul for the passage, drawing on the one consolation that had never failed her through all her troubles. If there is any comfort in her early dying, it is in that, the hope that she met it not in terror, but in faith. That the religion which had framed her whole course held her steady at its ending. And so, in the deep of winter, a few days before Christmas, in the year 1476, Isabel died. She was 25 years old. The grave, dutiful elder daughter, the much-tried duchess, the mother who had longed so hard for her children and had them for so short a time, slipped quietly out of her sorrowful days, worn out before she had truly lived, leaving her little ones motherless and her sister bereft. The wheel that had lifted her, so briefly, to the summit of her happiness had turned all the way down at last. And she, who had endured so much, was gone. I do not want to rush past the simple sadness of it. The bare human fact that a young woman of 25, who had suffered more than most suffer in a long lifetime, and had only just begun to taste joy, was dead. So let us pause here, at her passing, before we follow what came after. For her passing, gentle as it was in itself, would unleash a terrible madness in the husband she left behind, and would set in motion the ruin of her little family. But that is for the next part of our story. For now, let us simply mark her going. The quiet winter death of Isabel, Duchess of Clarence, daughter of the Kingmaker, at the age of 25. Come with me, gently, to what her loss meant, and to what it set loose. Isabel was dead at 25, and before we follow the dark events her death set loose, I want to stay with her a moment longer, to mark her passing as it deserves to be marked, and to lay her to rest. Quite literally, in the Abbey we visited together, before the story moves on without her. Her body was carried, as I told you it would be, to Tewkesbury, to the great abbey of her mother's line, the holy ground where her ancestors lay. There was a funeral of the kind her rank demanded, the solemn rites, the masses for her soul, the slow ceremony of laying a great lady to rest. It is said that her body lay for a time before the burial, watched and prayed over, as was the custom, and then she was laid in the abbey, among the forebears from whom all her wealth and all her troubles had flowed, come home at last to the one place that was wholly and anciently her family's. There she rests to this day, the much-tried duchess, in the beautiful abbey in the west, under the prayers of centuries, and in time her husband would be laid beside her. The two of them together at the last, whatever their marriage had been in life. And what are we to make of it, this short, sad, battered span, now that we have followed it to its end? 25 years, and so few of them happy. She was born to one of the greatest fortunes in England, and it gave her almost nothing but trouble, for it made her a prize to be fought over, rather than a person to be cherished. She was married to a prince, and stood within reach of a throne, and it won her exile and terror, and the loss of her first child on a fleeing ship. She cherished her sister, and her sister was torn from her and set on the far side of a war. She honoured her mother, and her mother was robbed and erased, while Isabel, helpless, profited from the wrong. She came at last into a few years of peace, and bore the children she had longed for, and then she died before she was old enough to see them grow, leaving them motherless in a world that would not be kind to them. It is, by any reckoning, a sorrowful story, a life of riches that brought no happiness, and love that brought mostly grief. And yet I do not want you to remember her only as a victim, only as a woman to whom things were done. For there is something in Isabel, glimpsed faintly through the few records that survive, that is more than mere suffering, a quiet strength, a dutiful endurance, a capacity for love that all the cruelty of her age could not extinguish. She bore what she was given to bear, the marriages and the wars and the losses, without, so far as we can tell, ever breaking, ever ceasing to cherish the people who mattered to her. She kept faith, I think, with her sister and her mother and her children, even when she could do nothing to protect them, holding on to love in a span that gave her so little room for it. That is a kind of strength the chroniclers never thought to praise, the quiet strength of a woman who endures and goes on giving, and Isabel had it, and it deserves to be remembered. She matters, too, beyond herself, for the blood she carried flowed on. Her daughter Margaret and her son Edward, the children she left motherless, would carry her line and her family's ancient blood forward into the future, into a later and stranger age, and through them, the Duchess, who died so young and so forgotten, would have descendants and consequences she could never have imagined. The girl who was a pawn in her father's schemes, the Duchess history half forgot, was the mother of a line that ran on after her, so that she was not, in the end, a dead end, but a channel. The blood of Warwick and of all those tombs at Tewkesbury passing through her into the generations that came after. But I will not pretend that her line ran on in peace, for it did not, and honesty asks that I tell you gently what became of the children she left. They had inherited, along with their mother's blood, the danger that came with it, and the cruel age was not finished with the family. Hard things waited for both of them, far down the years. But those sorrows lay decades ahead, and they belong to other stories, and I will say only a word of them at the very end. For now, Isabel's children were small and motherless, and their fate, in the immediate wake of her loss, was bound up with the terrible thing her dying did to their father. For Isabel's passing, gentle as it was, broke something in her husband. The loss of her seems to have unhinged him, tipped a man always unstable into something like madness, and in his grief and his paranoia, he would do a dreadful deed. And that deed would help to bring about his own destruction, and so to orphan Isabel's children entirely. The quiet winter passing of a young duchess was about to set loose a violence that would consume the family she left behind. Come with me, then, into the madness that Isabel's dying unleashed, and to the strange and terrible aftermath of her passing. Isabel's death did a terrible work upon the man she left behind, and in telling it, I must show you the darkest consequence of her passing, for her husband, unhinged by sorrow and by his own unstable nature, committed in the months after her dying an act of such cruelty and such lawless arrogance that it shocked even that hard age, and helped, in the end, to destroy him. It is a grim coda to Isabel's gentle dying, and I will tell it plainly, but without dwelling on horror, for it belongs to her story as the thing her death set loose. Clarence could not, or would not, accept that his wife had perished as so many women did, of the natural perils of childbed or of some wasting sickness. In his mourning, and perhaps in the guilt or the rage that grief can stir in an unstable mind, he convinced himself that Isabel had not gone naturally at all, but had been murdered, poisoned, done away with by some enemy. And having seized on that fixed and groundless idea, he looked about for someone to blame, and his eye fell upon one of Isabel's own servants, a gentlewoman who had attended her, one Anchoret Twinehoe, who had been one of the Duchess's ladies. Clarence decided, on no evidence that any court would recognise, that this lady had poisoned his wife. And then he did a dreadful deed, one that revealed how far his sorrow and his arrogance had carried him beyond all law and reason. He sent armed men to seize her from her home, far off in the West Country, and had her dragged across the land to his own town of Warwick. There he had her brought before a court that he himself controlled, accused of poisoning the Duchess, and the men of the jury, overawed and bullied by the Duke's power and his presence, did as he wished, and found her guilty. And within hours of her seizing, with a speed that made a mockery of justice, the woman was condemned and taken out and hanged. It was by any measure a judicial murder, the killing of an innocent under the forms of law by a great man who held himself above the law, and it was done in the name of Isabel, in a love for Isabel twisted into cruelty. I want to pause on the wrong of it, for the lady who perished deserves that much. She had done nothing. There is no reason to think Isabel was poisoned at all. She died, almost certainly, of the natural causes that killed so many young women of her age, and this gentlewoman, Anchoret, was guilty of nothing but having served her. She was seized and dragged across the country and hurried through a sham of a trial and hanged, all in a matter of days, all to satisfy the disordered sorrow and rage of a powerful man. It was so plainly unjust that it was remembered with horror, and not long afterward the woman was posthumously pardoned, her conviction recognized for the lawless thing it was. But the pardon could not bring her back. An innocent had perished for Isabel's sake. Killed by Isabel's husband, a second life thrown away in the dark wake of the first. The particulars of the thing, as they have come down to us, only sharpen its horror. The gentlewoman was taken from her own home in the West Country, seized by armed men sent for the purpose, and carried by force across a great stretch of England, through town after town, all the way to her accuser's stronghold. A journey of days during which she must have known, with mounting dread, what awaited her at its end. She was not the only one condemned. A second person, a man, was accused alongside her of a hand in the supposed poisoning, and he too was hurried to his end. And the speed of it was the very proof of its injustice. For a true trial takes time, weighs evidence, allows a defence, and this allowed none of those things. She was seized, hauled across the country, condemned, and hanged so swiftly that the whole murderous business was done almost in a single stroke. Years later, when the powerful man who had ordered it was himself dead, and could no longer overawe the courts, the dead gentlewoman's family at last won a formal recognition that the whole proceeding had been lawless and void. A small and bitter justice that came far too late to do her any good, but that stands at least as the verdict of history upon what was done in Isabel's name. And this lawless deed was the beginning of the end for Clarence himself. For in killing the woman as he did, in setting himself so openly above the law, in behaving as though he were a king who could condemn and execute at his own will, he frightened and angered the men who ruled the kingdom, and above all his own brother, the king. Clarence had always been unstable, always grasping, always a danger, and now, in the madness that followed her dying, he overreached at last beyond what even a royal brother could be allowed. Within a year he was arrested, charged with treason, and condemned to die, brought down in part by this very act of lawless cruelty that his grief for her had driven him to. How exactly Clarence died is a matter of legend more than certain record. The famous story, repeated ever since, is that he was put to death in private within the Tower of London by being drowned in a butt of sweet wine, of Malmsey. A strange and lurid end that may be true or may be a tale that grew up around his fall. We cannot be sure of the manner of it. But of the fact there is no doubt. Clarence was executed by his own brother's order, little more than a year after the wife whose loss had helped unhinge him. The charming, dangerous, treacherous prince that Isabel had been married to came at last to the traitor's end that his whole restless life had seemed to court. And so, within 14 months of Isabel's quiet winter passing, her husband too was dead, executed, and her children, the young daughter and son she had longed for and loved and lost so young, were orphaned entirely, with neither mother nor father left to them. The baby, the last son born at Tewkesbury, had died too, in the first days of that same hard year. The small family that had gathered so briefly at the summit of her happiness was scattered and broken, the parents both dead, the children abandoned in a world that had no mercy for the children of the great. What became of those orphaned children, and who, in the end, took them in, is the last thread of Isabel's story, and it brings us back, as it should, to her sister. Come with me to the end, and to the sister who kept faith. And so we come to the end of Isabel's story, and to the thing that redeems it, a touch from all its sorrow. For though Isabel herself was gone, lost at 25, her children orphaned, her husband executed, the love that had been the truest thing in her life did not die with her. It lived on in her sister. And it is with that, with the faithfulness of the bond between the two daughters of Warwick, that I want to leave you. For it is the gentlest and the most human note in all of this hard tale. When Isabel's children were left motherless and then fatherless, alone in the world with both their parents gone, it was Anne who took them in. The younger sister, the one who had shared Isabel's nursery and her exile and her grief. The one their father had once hidden away, gathered up Isabel's orphan daughter and son, and made them part of her own household, raised them alongside her own child, gave them a home and a place and a measure of safety in a world that had taken everything else from them. Whatever the quarrels of their husbands had been, whatever the bitter business of the inheritance, when it came to the children, Anne kept faith. She did for Isabel's children what Isabel would have done for hers, and in that deed, that quiet, practical, tender act of taking in her dead sister's orphans, we see the deep truth of what lay between the sisters all along, a love that outlived war and division and death itself. Think what that would have meant to Isabel. Could she have known it? The one fear that must have haunted her dying, beyond all others, was the fear for her little ones, the children she was leaving so young, so unprotected, in so dangerous a world. And the answer to that fear, though she did not live to see it, was her sister. The bond that their father had tried to spend, that the wars had strained, that their husband's greed had tested almost to breaking, proved in the end strong enough to shelter her orphaned children. Anne became, in a sense, a second mother to them, keeping them safe while she herself lived, honouring her sister in the most loving way one woman can honour another, by tending the children she left behind. The two girls from the nursery at Warwick kept faith with each other to the very end, and beyond it, there is sorrow still in the aftermath. For I will not pretend that all came right. Anne herself would not live very long. Within a few years she too would be gone, and the protection she gave Isabel's children would pass with her. And the children themselves, as I have told you, carried the same dangerous blood that had blighted their mother, and the cruel age was not done with the family. Both of them, in the fullness of time, the son in his youth and the daughter in her great old age, would meet hard ends at the hands of kings, victims, like Isabel before them, of the deadly value of their royal blood. The family's sorrows ran on, generation after generation, the shadow of their greatness following them down the years. But that is for other tellings, other nights. It is enough, for ours, to know that in the immediate wake of Isabel's death, when her children most needed it, her sister was there and took them in and kept them safe while she could. And there is one more figure to remember before we let the story rest, and that is the mother, the Countess, whom we last saw erased by the law, declared dead while she yet lived. Shut away in her sanctuary, she outlived them all. She outlived her husband, killed in battle. She outlived both her daughters, the Duchess dead at 25, and Anne not many years after. She lived on the erased and dispossessed Countess into old age, an old woman who had buried her entire family. the great inheritance that had been the ruin of them all long since stripped from her. There is no sadder figure in the whole story than that mother, outliving every one of her children. The living woman the law had called dead, going on and on after all her own were truly in their graves. And somewhere in those slow years she must have grieved for Isabel, her elder daughter, the grave dutiful girl she had raised and lost. One more sorrow in a life that held too many. The wheel even turned briefly and strangely, for the old countess at the very end of her days, for a new king came to the throne in time. The king who founded a new royal line, and under him she was at last. For a moment, restored to the great inheritance that had been taken from her, formally given back her lands, as though to right the ancient wrong. But it was a hollow restoration, for she was made, almost at once, to hand those same lands over to the new king, so that what looked like justice was only another taking by another sovereign. The erased and dispossessed countess used one last time as a legal instrument before being set aside again. She died at last an old woman who had outlived her husband and both her daughters and very nearly her whole world. The last survivor of the bright family that had once gathered at Calais and at Warwick, the grandmother of orphans, the mother of the dead. And of Isabel's own children, raised by the faithful Anne, the wheel would take its toll in time as well. The son and the daughter both going down in their separate later years before the suspicion and the cruelty of princes, the last victims of the dangerous blood that had brought their mother to so little joy and so much grief. The family's long sorrow did not end with Isabel. It ran on after her, down through the children she had cherished and lost, to the very edge of living memory. So that is the story of Isabel Neville, the elder daughter of the Kingmaker, the Duchess history half forgot. She was born to greatness, and it brought her grief. She loved her sister and her mother and her children, and could protect none of them, and was cherished in return, faithfully, by the sister who kept her orphans safe. She suffered more than most suffer in a long lifetime, and she did it young, and she died before she was old enough to see her children grow. And yet she was not nothing, not merely a victim, not merely a pawn. She was a real woman, who loved and endured and kept faith, and whose blood ran on into the generations after her, and who deserves, after all this time, to be remembered as herself, and not only as a footnote to greater names. And now let us let her rest, as she rests still, in the great abbey in the west, among the ancestors of her line, under the prayers of centuries. Her stormy life ended in that quiet and holy ground. Let the wars fall silent. Let the quarrels of the great men sink away. Let the two of them be together again in our minds, as they were at the beginning, two little girls in a nursery at Warwick before any of it came, when the only thing that mattered to either of them was the other. Let Isabel be that girl again, safe and young and whole, with her whole life before her and nothing yet decided, her sister beside her, her mother near, the candles warm, the long-ordered day drawing gently to its close. Let her be at peace there, in that bright, unending evening of before. And let us, you and I, sink down towards sleep alongside her into the same soft dark, leaving the grave, dutiful girl from Warwick to her well-earned rest. Before you drift the last of the way down into sleep, let me say one quiet word, as I promised I would, and then I will leave you to your rest. Isabel was real, and the shape of her days is drawn with care from the histories and the records that survive, but a great deal of the inner world of it, her feelings, her small private joys and griefs, the things no chronicle thought to keep, I have gently reconstructed so that we might be with her as a person, and not only as a name in someone else's story. If the few hours we have spent together in her world have been a comfort to you, and you would like to find your way back to evenings like this one, then you are always welcome to stay, and there will be other nights and other far-off lives waiting whenever you wish to return to them. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.